Hello everyone, tonight I've got 15 special scary stories for all of you. I know many of you watch these videos to fall asleep, so before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Mr. Nightspook, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. When I first arrived at that budget hotel during my work trip, I didn't think anything of it, but looking back, that was my first mistake. My name is Vincent Alder. I work in logistics, which means I spend the majority of my time driving between different regional warehouses and distribution centers. The company I work for is notoriously cheap when it comes to travel expenses, so I'm usually forced to book the most affordable motels I can find right off the interstate. I'm used to staying in rundown places, so my expectations are always incredibly low. I just need a bed and a working shower. This specific trip took me out to a fairly rural part of the state. I had been driving for over 8 hours straight, and the sun had gone down a long time ago. By the time I finally pulled into the parking lot of the motel, it was already past 10 p.m. The entire property looked practically abandoned. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a massive semi-truck idling in the back corner and a rusted sedan parked near the front office. The guy working the front desk looked like he was half asleep. He barely spoke a word to me during the check-in process. He just took my corporate card, printed a receipt, and handed me a plastic keycard for room 214. He pointed toward a set of exterior stairs at the far end of the building and went right back to staring at his phone. I grabbed my duffel bag from my car and walked toward the stairs. The night air was freezing and the wind was picking up. I walked up to the second floor and found my room. It was located at the very end of a long, badly lit outdoor walkway that had been enclosed with cheap glass panels. I usually prefer rooms at the end of the hall because it means you do not have to deal with people walking past your window all night. I swiped my keycard and the heavy metal door clicked open. The room was exactly what you would expect from a $50 motel. The carpet had dark, unidentifiable stains, the bedspread looked ancient, and there was a lingering smell of old cigarette smoke trying to be masked by cheap cleaning chemicals. I dropped my bag on the floor and locked the deadbolt. There was a small wooden desk near the television. Sitting right in the center of the desk was one of those cheap plastic ice buckets that hotels provide. I remember taking a close look at it because it had a large, jagged crack running along the top edge. It looked dirty inside, and I made a mental note not to use it. I just wanted to get some sleep before I had to be at the warehouse at 6 a.m. the next morning. I took a fast shower, turned off all the lights, and climbed into bed. The mattress was incredibly stiff, but I was so exhausted from the long drive that I did not care. I closed my eyes, listening to the dull hum of the air conditioning unit under the window. I was just starting to drift off into a deep sleep when a sudden noise woke me up. It was the loud, mechanical roaring sound of an ice machine turning on. I opened my eyes and looked toward the door. The sound was coming from the hallway, right outside. A few seconds later, I heard the heavy, aggressive clattering sound of large ice cubes dropping down a metal chute and hitting the bottom of a hard plastic container. I let out a frustrated sigh and rolled over, burying my face in the flat pillow. I knew there was a vending area somewhere nearby, but I had not realized it was located directly across from my door. It was annoying, but people use hotel ice machines all the time. I figured whoever it was would finish filling their bucket, head back to their room, and that would be the end of it. I listened as the sound of falling ice stopped. The machine shut down with a heavy mechanical clunk. A moment later, I heard the sound of slow footsteps walking away down the carpeted hallway. They faded out completely. The silence returned to the corridor. I adjusted my blanket, closed my eyes again, and tried to force myself back to sleep. Just as I felt my body starting to relax, the sudden mechanical roar of the ice machine started up again. I flinched slightly. It was followed immediately by the loud, chaotic clattering of ice dropping into a bucket. I reached over to the nightstand and tapped my phone screen to check the time. The bright digital numbers read 11:20 p.m. I felt a little irritated. It seemed really strange for someone to come out and get a second full bucket of ice just 20 minutes after their first trip, especially this late on a Tuesday night. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the person to leave. The machine shut off. Then the footsteps started again. They sounded slow and deliberate, moving away from my room and down the hall toward the staircase. I waited a few more minutes to make sure the hallway was clear, then closed my eyes. 20 minutes later, at exactly 11:40 p.m., the entire sequence repeated itself. The roar of the motor, the heavy clatter of the ice, the sound of the machine shutting down, and then the slow footsteps walking away. I sat up in bed, something felt off. 3 trips to the ice machine in less than an hour made absolutely no sense. I tried to rationalize it in my head. Maybe a family was filling a large cooler for a camping trip, or maybe there were a bunch of people having a party in one of the rooms downstairs. But none of those explanations felt right. The hotel was completely dead. There was no noise coming from anywhere else in the building. There was no music, no muffled talking, nothing. Just pure, heavy silence, broken only by the ice machine. I decided to just stay awake and wait. I sat up against the headboard, watching the minutes slowly change on my phone. The digital clock rolled over to midnight. Right on schedule, the heavy machinery in the hallway roared to life. The ice hit the plastic bucket with a violent, crashing noise. I paid close attention to the sounds in the hallway. This time, when the machine turned off, the footsteps did not walk away toward the stairs. They were walking toward my room. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps sounded strange, like the wet squeak of rubber soles dragging on the thin carpet. They were moving incredibly slow. Squeak, squeak, squeak. They got closer and closer. I kept waiting for them to walk past my window or stop at the room next door, but they did not. The squeaking stopped right in front of my door. My stomach dropped. I sat frozen in the darkness of my room. I listened intensely, waiting for the sound of a keycard sliding into the lock of the room next door or the sound of a handle turning. But there was absolutely nothing, just total silence. Whoever had been getting the ice was now just standing perfectly still in the hallway, directly on the other side of my door. I did not move a muscle. My heart was pounding hard in my chest. I kept staring at the thin sliver of light coming from underneath the door frame, looking for shadows. I sat there in the dark for what felt like 10 minutes, completely paralyzed by the unnatural silence. Then very slowly, I heard the wet, squeaking footsteps start up again. They turned around and slowly walked back down the hallway, fatting away toward the stairs. I let out a breath I had been holding in. I felt incredibly uneasy. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I was not going to be able to sleep. For the next 2 hours, the exact same pattern continued. Every 20 minutes, like clockwork, the machine would turn on, the ice would fall, the wet footsteps would slowly approach my door. The person would stand in complete silence directly outside my room for several minutes. Then they would turn around and walk away. By 2:30 a.m., my fear had mixed with severe sleep deprivation, making me feel highly paranoid. I could not take the mental torture of sitting in the dark anymore. I needed to know who was out there and what they were doing. The next time the machine went off, I quietly slipped out of bed. I crept barefoot across the carpet, moving as silently as possible, and pressed my eye directly against the small glass peephole in the door. The hallway was mostly empty, illuminated only by a few flickering fluorescent lights. I could see the ice machine alcove slightly down the hall to my left. There was no one standing there. I kept my eye glued to the peephole, refusing to blink. At exactly 2:40 a.m., I saw a figure step out from the dark stairwell in the middle of the hallway. The lighting was terrible, so I could only make out a dark silhouette. It was a very tall man. He moved with a horrible, dragging limp, like one of his legs was completely stiff. He slowly walked over to the ice machine and pushed his hand against the silver lever. I heard the familiar clattering sound echo through the door. I could see he was holding something in his hands to catch the ice, but it was too dark to see what it was. Once the ice stopped falling, the tall man slowly turned his body toward my end of the hallway. He started walking. I could hear the wet, dragging squeak of his shoes through the door. I did not move. I stayed completely still, watching him get closer and closer to my room. He was wearing a heavy, dark coat that looked completely out of place for the mild weather. His head was tilted slightly to the side at an unnatural angle. As he reached my door, he stopped. He was standing so close to the wood that his dark coat completely filled the view of the peephole. I could not see his face, just the rough, dirty fabric of his jacket. I held my breath, terrified that he would hear me breathing on the other side. He stood there for a full 2 minutes, completely silent, before slowly turning around and dragging his feet back down the hall. I stepped back from the door, my hands shaking violently. I felt completely isolated. I knew calling the front desk would be useless. That guy was not going to leave his chair to help me. I looked at the time on my phone. It was almost 3 a.m. I decided that the next time the machine went off, I was going to catch him in the act. I was going to throw the door open and confront him while he was standing at the machine. I stood right next to the door, resting my hand lightly on the cold metal handle, waiting. At exactly 3 a.m., the loud hum of the ice machine echoed down the hall. I heard the heavy clatter of the ice cubes dropping. This time I did not wait for the footsteps to start. The very second the sound of the falling ice stopped, I unlocked the deadbolt, yanked the heavy door open, and stepped right out into the hallway. The hallway was completely empty. There was no tall man in a dark coat. There was no one standing by the ice machine. Every single door in the corridor was shut tight. There had not been enough time for him to walk back to the stairs, and I had not heard any doors close. I had opened my door the exact second he finished getting the ice, but there was absolutely nobody there. I stood there in the dim, flickering light, feeling a deep sense of panic. The air in the hallway felt freezing cold. I started to step back inside my room when I looked down at the floor. Sitting perfectly centered on the cheap welcome mat outside my door was a small plastic bucket. It was completely filled to the brim with fresh, melting ice cubes. Water was dripping down the sides, leaving a dark, wet stain on the carpet. I stared at it. I recognized it immediately. It had a large, jagged crack running along the top edge. It was the bucket from my room. I slowly backed inside and looked over at the small wooden desk near the television. The desk was completely empty. I slammed the door shut, locked the deadbolt, pushed the heavy armchair in front of the handle, and sat on the edge of the bed until the sun came up. I packed my bag as soon as it was light out and never went back to that hotel. How do you think he got the bucket out of my room without me noticing? Story 2. It was around late September when I first started noticing something was off, and it only got worse from there. My name is Harper Linwood. I live by myself in a fairly quiet suburban neighborhood. The houses here are spaced pretty far apart, and I have a long, slightly curved driveway that leads from the street up to my attached garage. I have a very set routine for the house. Every Thursday night, right after I finish eating dinner, I take my large green trash bin down the driveway and leave it at the curb for the Friday morning pickup. I have lived in this house for over 2 years, and I have never had a problem with any of my neighbors. Most people here are older and generally keep to themselves. The first time it happened, I did not think much of it. It was a normal Friday morning. I walked out of my front door in my work clothes to grab the empty bin from the curb and bring it back up to the side of the garage. I walked down the long driveway, but when I got near the street, I noticed the bin was not sitting by the mailbox where I always leave it. I looked around and saw it sitting about 10 feet up my driveway, pushed slightly off the concrete and into the wet grass. I figured the garbage truck driver was just running behind schedule and had tossed it back carelessly after emptying it. It was slightly annoying because I had to drag it through the morning dew to get it back to the concrete, but it did not seem like a big deal at all. I just rolled it up to the house and went to work. The following Thursday night, the weather was surprisingly cold. I put on a light jacket, rolled the heavy bin down the driveway, and made sure to place it perfectly flat on the pavement right next to the street. I went back inside, locked the doors, and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up a little late. I rushed out the front door and got straight into my car. I hit the button for the garage door to close, put the car in reverse, and looked at my rearview camera. I immediately slammed on the brakes. The green plastic bin was sitting exactly halfway up my driveway. It was placed perfectly in the center of the concrete, directly blocking my path to the street. I put the car in park and just stared at the screen on my dashboard. I felt uneasy. It was not just carelessly tossed aside this time. It was deliberately placed right in the middle of my driveway. I had to get out of my warm car, walk down the cold concrete, and move it out of the way just so I could leave for work. I spent the entire drive trying to figure out why a sanitation worker would walk a heavy plastic bin 20 feet up a residential driveway. It made absolutely no sense. By the time the next Thursday rolled around, I was paying close attention. I took the trash out around 8 p.m. It was already completely dark outside. I rolled the bin all the way down to the curb, positioned it next to the mailbox, and walked back up to the house. I went about my normal evening routine, watching television and cleaning up the kitchen. Around 11:30 p.m., right before I went upstairs to bed, I decided to look out the front window of my living room. The streetlights outside provided a decent amount of orange light, casting long shadows across the front lawn. I looked down toward the street to check on the bin. It was gone from the curb. I pressed my face closer to the cold glass of the window, squinting into the darkness. My stomach dropped. The heavy green bin was sitting right at the edge of my front landscaping, maybe 20 feet away from my front porch. The garbage truck does not come through our neighborhood until 6 in the morning. Someone had moved it. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the street. There were no cars driving by. There was no one walking on the sidewalks. The neighborhood was completely silent. Whoever had moved it was already out of sight. I made sure every single door and window in the house was locked before I finally went upstairs to try and sleep. I kept waking up every few hours, listening for any weird noises outside, but I did not hear anything. The following week, I decided I was going to figure out who was doing this. When Thursday night came, I took the trash out at 9 p.m. I walked back inside, turned off every single light on the first floor of my house, and pulled a chair up to the living room window. I sat there in the pitch black, staring directly down the driveway at the green bin sitting by the curb. I sat there for hours. 10 p.m. passed, 11 p.m. passed. By midnight, the street was completely dead. I was exhausted and my eyes were burning from staring at the dark driveway. Nothing had happened. The bin remained perfectly still next to the mailbox. Around 1 a.m., my throat felt incredibly dry. I decided to get up and grab a quick glass of water from the kitchen. I kept the lights off and navigated by the moonlight coming through the windows. I walked into the kitchen, filled a glass from the sink, drank it, and walked straight back into the living room. I was gone for maybe 3 minutes maximum. I sat back down in the chair and looked out the window. The bin was no longer at the curb. I quickly scanned the long driveway, expecting to see it halfway up the concrete again. It was not there. I leaned forward in my chair, looking closer to the house. It was sitting right in the middle of my front walkway, less than 10 feet away from the window I was looking out of. Something felt off. It felt incredibly wrong. I had not heard a single thing while I was in the kitchen. The wheels on that plastic bin are loud. They make a harsh, scraping sound when they roll over the concrete driveway. But the neighborhood was dead quiet. Someone had to have physically lifted the heavy bin off the ground and carried it all the way up the driveway to avoid making any noise. I sat there in the dark, staring at the dark green plastic. The lid was completely shut. There was no one standing around it. I looked at the bushes, the shadows near the garage, and the dark space under the large oak tree in my front yard. I could not see anyone hiding. My frustration suddenly outweighed my fear. I was tired of this strange game. I wanted to see if they had put something inside it or if they were just trying to mess with me. I stood up from the chair, walked over to the front door, and unlocked the deadbolt. I opened the door and stepped out onto the concrete porch. The night air was freezing and a slight breeze was blowing through the trees. The neighborhood was totally silent. I stood on the porch for a moment, looking around the yard one last time before I walked down the 3 brick steps toward the walkway. I approached the bin. It looked completely normal from the outside. I reached out and grabbed the thick plastic handle to pull it back down to the street. As soon as I pulled on it, I realized something was wrong. It was incredibly heavy. It felt like it was bolted to the ground. When I took it down to the curb earlier that night, there were only 2 light kitchen bags inside. Now, it felt like it weighed over 50 pounds. I let go of the handle and placed my hand on the top of the lid. I slowly flipped it open. The orange light from the street lamp barely reached the inside of the deep bin. I looked down. My white kitchen trash bags had been forcefully pushed flat down to the very bottom. Sitting directly on top of them was a massive, dirty cinder block. I just stared at it. I do not own any cinder blocks. There was no construction going on anywhere near my house. Someone had brought it with them and carefully placed it inside my trash. While I was standing there staring into the dark bin, I heard a sound. It was a soft, slow, rustling noise. It was coming from the large, thick bushes directly next to my front living room window, the exact window I had been sitting behind just a few minutes ago. I froze. I did not close the lid. I did not turn my head. I just stood perfectly still on the walkway, listening. A few seconds later, I heard the heavy, deliberate sound of dirt shifting. It sounded like a large shoe slowly adjusting its weight in the soil behind the thick branches. Someone was standing inside the bushes, pressed right up against the brick wall of my house. They were less than 6 feet away from me. I slowly took a step backward. I kept my eyes locked on the dark shape of the bushes. I took another step back, moving toward the porch. I did not hear any more rustling, but I could feel the intense, heavy sensation of someone watching me from the dark gaps between the leaves. I carefully walked backward up the brick steps. I reached behind me, grabbed the handle of the front door, and slipped back inside the house. I pushed the door shut as quietly as I could and twisted the deadbolt. I locked the chain. I stepped back into the hallway, my chest rising and falling quickly. I did not go back to the window. I did not want to look outside. I walked around the first floor in the dark, checking every single window lock and making sure the door leading into the garage was secure. I sat on the floor in the hallway until the sun finally came up. Around 7 a.m., I heard the loud mechanical grinding of the garbage truck making its way down my street. I slowly stood up and walked into the living room. I looked out the front window. The green bin was completely gone from my front walkway. I looked down the long driveway. It was sitting perfectly on the curb next to the mailbox, right where I had originally placed it the night before. I opened the front door and walked outside in the daylight. The air was crisp and clear. I walked down the driveway to the curb and flipped open the lid of the bin. It was completely empty. The trash bags were gone. The cinder block was gone. I slowly walked back up the driveway toward the house. I stopped when I reached the front walkway. I looked over at the thick bushes sitting beneath my living room window. The dark mulch had been completely trampled. The branches were slightly broken and bent out of shape. Deeply pressed into the soft dirt directly beneath the glass of my window were two large, heavy boot prints. They were facing the glass, who was standing in the dark watching me sit in my living room. Story 3. At first, I thought it was just my imagination while I was walking past the small neighborhood playground, until it happened again. My name is Callum Drexler. I work at a local grocery store doing overnight inventory. My shift is long and physically draining, and it usually ends around 11:30 p.m. I do not own a car, so I walk home every night. It is about a 20-minute walk from the sliding glass doors of the store to the front lobby of my apartment building. I actually like the walk most of the time. It gives me a chance to clear my head, and the streets are usually completely empty. The route I take goes straight through a very quiet, older residential neighborhood. The houses are small, and the streetlights are spaced pretty far apart, creating long stretches of dark sidewalk. About halfway to my apartment, the path passes directly next to a small, rundown community playground. It is not much of a park. There is just a faded plastic slide, a wooden sandbox, and a heavy metal swing set with two black rubber seats. It sits right next to the sidewalk, separated only by a low wooden border filled with dark wood chips. It was a Tuesday night in late October when I noticed something strange. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the air felt freezing cold. I was walking home with my hands shoved deep into my jacket pockets, just wanting to get inside. As I approached the playground, the orange glow from a nearby streetlight cast long, distorted shadows over the wood chips. I happened to glance over at the metal swing set as I walked by. The swing on the right was moving. It was not swinging very high. It was just a gentle, rhythmic back-and-forth motion. I stopped walking for a second and looked at the trees surrounding the park. The branches were completely still. There was no wind at all. The heavy black rubber seat just kept moving in a perfect, slow rhythm. I felt a little uneasy, but I brushed it off. I figured a kid must have been out there late and had just run off as I approached. I kept my head down and finished the walk home. The next night, I finished my shift at exactly 11:30 p.m. again. I took my normal route. I walked past the quiet houses, my shoes making a soft tapping noise on the cold concrete. As I got closer to the playground, I remembered what I had seen the night before. I looked over toward the dark wood chips. The swing on the right was moving again. It was the exact same motion as the night before, same slow, steady rhythm, same gentle arc. I looked at the swing on the left. It was hanging perfectly still. Something felt off. A heavy metal swing does not just keep its momentum like that for no reason, especially on a completely calm, windless night. I stopped walking. I stood on the edge of the sidewalk, just watching the dark silhouette of the rubber seat move back and forth in the dim light. As I stood there, I started to hear a faint sound. It was a rhythmic squeaking noise coming from the rusted chain at the top of the metal frame. It sounded incredibly deliberate. The squeaking matched the slow rhythm perfectly. It sounded exactly like someone was sitting on the seat, gently dragging their feet in the wood chips to push themselves back and forth. I looked closely at the empty seat. There was absolutely nobody there. I did not like the feeling I was getting. The park felt too quiet. I started walking again, picking up my pace until I reached my apartment. I made sure my door was locked and tried to put it out of my mind. For the next 2 nights, I decided to take a different route home. It added about 10 minutes to my walk, taking me down a busier street with more traffic lights. It was annoying, but I just did not want to walk past that park in the dark. By Saturday night, however, I was exhausted. We had received a massive delivery at the store, and I had spent my entire shift lifting heavy boxes. My feet were throbbing, and my legs felt completely numb. When I walked out of the store at midnight, I just wanted to get to my bed as fast as possible. I looked down the road and decided to take my normal, shorter route. I convinced myself I had just been overly tired and paranoid earlier in the week. I reached the edge of the neighborhood around 12:15 a.m. The air was incredibly heavy and dead. There was no breeze, no cars driving by, and no lights on in any of the nearby houses. It felt completely isolated. As I approached the playground, I kept my eyes focused straight ahead on the sidewalk. I did not want to look at the swing set. I just wanted to walk right past it and go home. But as I got within 50 feet of the wood chips, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was the squeaking noise from the rusted chain. But it was much louder than before. I slowly turned my head and looked toward the metal frame. The swing on the right was moving, but it was not a gentle sway anymore. It was swinging high. The black rubber seat was arcing aggressively into the air, reaching the peak of its height before dropping back down. The rusted chains were groaning and grinding against the metal bar. The sound was harsh and metallic. The chain sounded strained. It sounded like there was a massive amount of weight pressing down on the seat. I stood frozen on the concrete, my stomach dropped. I was maybe 30 feet away, staring directly at the empty seat violently swinging back and forth. The swing on the left was still completely motionless. There was no one in the park. There was no wind, just the heavy, aggressive squeaking noise cutting through the silent neighborhood. I could not look away. I just watched it, trying to process what was happening. It made no logical sense. Then, as I was staring right at it, the swing did something impossible. It did not slow down. It did not gradually lose its momentum. It just completely stopped. It froze dead center at the absolute lowest point of its arc. It happened in an instant. 1 second it was flying through the air, and the next it was completely motionless, as if someone incredibly heavy had suddenly slammed their feet firmly into the wood chips to halt the momentum. The sudden silence was horrifying. The loud squeaking noise vanished entirely. The heavy black rubber seat hung perfectly still in the dim orange light. I did not move. I could barely breathe. The chains holding the seat were completely taut. They were not swaying or shaking at all. They were pulled tight, straight down to the rubber seat, just like they would be if someone were sitting there, staring right back at me. I felt incredibly exposed, standing alone under the street lamp. The playground was too dark, and the shadows from the equipment stretched out across the grass toward me. I knew I needed to get away from there immediately. I did not want to turn my back to the swing set. I took a slow step backward on the concrete sidewalk. The swing remained perfectly motionless. The silence in the neighborhood felt heavy and suffocating. I took another slow step backward, my eyes locked on the empty black seat. My heart was pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath, forced myself to turn around and face the direction of my apartment. I started walking fast. I did not run because I did not want to make too much noise, but I moved as quickly as I could down the dark sidewalk. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and that park as possible. I took about 10 fast steps away from the playground. Then I heard a sound directly behind me. It was the heavy, rhythmic squeaking noise of the rusted chain. But it sounded different. It was incredibly loud, and it sounded way too close. It did not sound like it was coming from the metal frame 30 feet away in the wood chips. It sounded like it was right on the sidewalk, directly behind me. The squeaking noise was slow and deliberate. It matched the exact same rhythm I had heard on Tuesday night, but this time it sounded like it was right over my shoulder. I did not turn around. I broke into a full sprint. I ran straight down the middle of the dark road. My heavy work shoes slammed against the pavement, echoing between the quiet houses. I did not look back. I just kept running, staring at the streetlights ahead of me. I ran past 3 blocks, my lungs burning in the freezing air, until I finally reached the front glass doors of my apartment building. I shoved the door open, rushed inside, and slammed it shut behind me. I scanned my key fob, unlocked the lobby door, and ran up the stairs to my floor. I locked my apartment door, threw the deadbolt, and collapsed on my couch. I sat there in the dark for hours, listening to the silence of my living room, waiting to hear a squeaking noise outside my door. I never walked past that playground at night again. I take the longer route every single time now, no matter how tired I am or how much my feet hurt. I refuse to even go near that street after the sun goes down. But sometimes, when I am lying in bed late at night and my apartment is completely quiet, I swear I can hear something outside. Over the low hum of the refrigerator and the wind blowing against the building, I hear a faint, metallic sound coming from the street below my window. It is a slow, steady squeaking noise, the exact same rhythm from the rusted chain. What do you think was sitting on that swing? Story 4. Everything started off normal at my studio apartment, maybe a little too normal. My name is Simon Calderon. I moved into a small studio on the 3rd floor of an older brick building near the city center about 6 months ago. Living in a single open room means you get very used to the layout. My bed sits in the far corner near the window, my small kitchen area is against the opposite wall, and the bathroom is right in the middle, adjacent to the front door. From my mattress, I have a direct line of sight straight into the bathroom if the door is left open. I work as a receptionist at a busy medical clinic, so my weekdays are completely exhausting. By the time I get home, I usually just take a shower, make a quick dinner, and go straight to sleep. The bathroom in my unit is incredibly narrow. It just has a sink, a toilet, and a stand-up shower stall. Because there is no space for a metal towel rack on the walls, the landlord had installed a heavy, curved metal hook directly into the solid wood on the back of the bathroom door. That is where I always hang my dark gray shower towel. It was a Tuesday evening in late March when the pattern started. I had taken a hot shower around 9 p.m., dried off, and hung the damp gray towel over the metal hook. I always made sure to loop the thickest part of the fabric over the top so it would not slide off. I left the bathroom door open a few inches to let the steam escape, turned out the lights in the apartment, and went to bed. When my alarm went off at 6 a.m. the next morning, I got up and walked into the bathroom to start getting ready for work. I reached for the back of the door to grab my towel, but the metal hook was empty. I looked down. The towel was lying in a crumpled pile on the white tile floor. It was slightly annoying, but I did not really think anything of it. Heavy towels can slide off hooks if they are not balanced right, especially when they are wet and heavy. I picked it up, threw it in my laundry hamper, and grabbed a fresh one from my closet. I went to work and forgot all about it. That night I took my normal shower before bed. I took the new towel, which was a thick white cotton one, and made absolutely sure to push it deep down onto the curved metal hook. I pressed my hand against it to flatten it out, checking to make sure it was completely secure. There was no way gravity was going to pull it down. I pushed the bathroom door until it was almost closed, leaving just a tiny crack, and went to sleep. I woke up the next morning, feeling completely rested. I walked over to the bathroom and pushed the wooden door open. The white towel was not on the hook. I looked down at the floor near the door, expecting to see it sitting on the tiles underneath the hook, but it was not there. I looked around the small space. The towel was lying completely flat on the floor in the exact center of the bathroom. It was at least 3 feet away from the back of the door. Something felt off. A towel slipping off a hook dropped straight down. It does not fall, roll across the room, and lay itself out flat near the shower drain. I stood in the doorway just staring at it. I live completely alone. I do not have a cat or a dog that could have dragged it. The windows in the apartment were locked tight, and there were no heating vents in the bathroom floor that could blow air around. I felt a little uneasy, but I tried to rationalize it. I figured maybe I had somehow caught the edge of the towel with the door when I was leaving the bathroom the night before, pulling it off the hook and dragging it into the room before it fell. It was a stretch, but it was the only thing that made any logical sense to me. I picked up the white fabric, put it in the hamper, and got ready for my day. By Thursday night, the situation had been bothering me all day. I wanted to prove to myself that it was just a strange accident and nothing more. I took my shower at 10 p.m. I grabbed a dry blue towel and hooked it firmly onto the metal piece on the back of the door. This time I did not just hang it. I grabbed a plastic laundry basket from my closet and placed it directly underneath the hook. If the towel slipped in the middle of the night, it would land directly inside the basket. There was no physical way for it to end up anywhere else. I left the bathroom door open exactly halfway. I turned off my bedside lamp, pulled the heavy blankets up to my chin, and fell asleep facing the dark bathroom doorway. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. I did not hear a noise and my alarm had not gone off. My eyes just snapped open. The apartment was completely silent. The only light in the room was the faint orange glow coming from the streetlights outside my window, casting long, distorted shadows across my studio. I rolled over and looked at the digital clock on my microwave across the room. It read 3:30 a.m. I was feeling incredibly thirsty, so I sat up in bed to go get a glass of water from the kitchen sink. As I swung my legs over the side of the mattress, my eyes naturally looked toward the open bathroom door in the middle of the apartment. My stomach dropped. The metal hook on the back of the door was completely bare. The blue towel was gone. I did not get up immediately. I just sat on the edge of my bed, staring into the dark bathroom. I felt a knot forming in my chest. I slowly stood up, walked across the hardwood floor, and stopped at the threshold of the bathroom. I looked down at the plastic laundry basket I had placed under the hook. It was completely empty. I looked to my left. The blue towel was lying in a bundled pile in the very back corner of the bathroom, wedged tightly between the base of the toilet and the wall. It was at least 5 feet away from the door. My breathing got shallow. There was absolutely no way it had just fallen. Someone or something had deliberately taken it off the hook, carried it past the basket, and shoved it into the dark corner. I backed out of the bathroom, turned on every single light in my studio, and checked the deadbolt on my front door. It was still locked tight. The security chain was still in place. Nobody had come inside. I sat in the chair next to my kitchen counter for the rest of the night, just staring at the bathroom door until the sun came up. By Friday evening, I was physically exhausted and highly paranoid. I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched inside my own home. I did not want to take a shower. I did not even want to use the bathroom. But I knew I could not just live in fear over a piece of fabric. I needed to see exactly what was happening. At 11 p.m., I took a fresh towel and hung it on the hook. I pushed it down as far as the metal would allow. I left the plastic basket in the hallway. I positioned the bathroom door so it was open wide enough for me to have a perfect, unobstructed view of the back of the door directly from my bed. I turned off all the lights in the apartment. I lay down on my mattress, pulled the blankets up, and stared straight at the dark silhouette of the towel hanging in the bathroom. I decided I was not going to sleep. I was going to watch it all night if I had to. The first hour passed slowly. The building was quiet. I could hear the faint sound of cars driving by on the street outside, but inside my apartment it was completely silent. The towel just hung there, a dark, heavy mass against the lighter wood of the door. It did not move an inch. By 1 a.m., my eyes were getting heavy. I forced myself to stay awake, blinking hard and shifting my position on the mattress to keep my focus sharp. 2 a.m. passed. The towel remained perfectly still. I started to feel a little ridiculous. I told myself it was all just in my head and that I should just go to sleep. At exactly 2:45 a.m., I noticed a change in the room. The air in the apartment suddenly felt incredibly cold. It was a sharp, freezing drop in temperature that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. I stopped shifting on my bed. I held my breath and kept my eyes locked on the bathroom door. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then I saw it. The bottom edge of the heavy towel began to move. It was not swinging like there was a breeze. It was a slow, deliberate shifting of the fabric. The dark mass slowly began to rise upward. I lay completely frozen on my mattress. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest I could hear it in my ears. I watched in total disbelief as the center of the towel was pushed up, defying gravity. It moved smoothly, sliding inch by inch up the curved metal prong of the hook. There were no hands holding it. There was no shadow standing behind it. The bathroom was completely empty. But the towel was moving exactly as if an invisible person had grabbed it by the top and was carefully lifting it off the door. It reached the very tip of the metal hook. It paused there for a brief second, hanging precariously over the edge. Then it dropped. I heard a soft thud as the heavy fabric hit the tile floor. I did not move a muscle. I lay in the darkness, staring at the empty metal hook. The silence in the apartment was deafening. I waited for something else to happen. I waited for a sound, a footstep, a shadow moving across the doorway, but there was absolutely nothing, just the empty hook and the cold air. I stayed awake in my bed for 3 more hours, too terrified to move. When the gray morning light finally started filtering through my window, I slowly got up from the mattress. My legs felt weak as I walked across the hardwood floor toward the bathroom. I stood in the doorway and looked inside. The towel was not sitting under the hook where it had dropped. It was lying perfectly flat, completely spread out across the white tiles, covering the entire center of the floor. But that was not what made me back away. Directly in the center of the flattened towel, pressed deeply into the thick fabric, was the clear, perfect indentation of a bare footprint. Who was standing in my bathroom while I was watching from my bed. Story 5. I had been to the open parking lot near my office plenty of times before, and nothing ever happened until that night. My name is Dominic Rains. I work for a large accounting firm located in a fairly busy commercial district. The building my company leases does not have its own dedicated parking garage. Instead, most of the employees are forced to either hunt for expensive street parking every morning or pay a monthly fee to use a massive, open dirt and gravel lot located about 3 blocks away. I always use the open lot because it is the most affordable option, and the short walk to the office gives me a few minutes to wake up before my shift starts. The lot is essentially just a giant, uneven square of packed dirt covered in loose gray gravel. It is surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence on 3 sides. The back edge of the property borders a dense line of thick, overgrown pine trees that separate the commercial district from an older residential neighborhood. Because the parking is so cheap, the lot fills up incredibly fast every single morning. If you do not pull your car in by 7:30 a.m., you're going to end up driving up and down the narrow aisles for 20 minutes, just waiting for someone to leave. It is a frustrating way to start the day, but there was one detail about that lot that always bothered me. In the very back corner, directly pressed up against the chain-link fence and the dark line of pine trees, there was one specific parking spot that was always empty. I noticed it a few months after I started working at the firm. It did not have any signs posted in front of it. There were no painted yellow lines crossing it out, and the lot attendant never placed orange traffic cones to block it off. It was just a standard, unmarked space on the dirt, but no matter how crowded the lot got, no one ever parked there. I would sit in my car and watch people idle their engines in the aisles, clearly desperate for a space, completely ignoring that open spot in the back corner. It was a Wednesday in late November when my routine finally broke. I had accidentally slept through my alarm and was running way behind schedule. It had rained heavily the night before, and the morning air was freezing cold. When I finally pulled my sedan into the gravel lot, it was already 8:45 a.m. The place was absolutely jammed. Cars were packed in tight, and several other frustrated drivers were already circling the perimeter looking for an opening. I drove up and down the lanes twice, but there was nothing available. I was already late for an important morning meeting with my manager, and my stress levels were peaking. Out of pure frustration, I drove my car straight toward the back corner of the lot. The spot by the trees was empty, just like it always was. I felt a little uneasy as I pulled my car into the space. I put the vehicle in park and sat there for a second, half expecting the lot attendant to run over and yell at me, or expecting to see a reserved sign I had somehow missed, but nobody came. The space was perfectly fine. I turned off the engine, grabbed my heavy briefcase from the passenger seat, and walked the 3 blocks to my office. The day was incredibly busy. I ended up having to stay late to finish a complicated financial report for a client. By the time I finally packed up my desk and left the building, it was almost 8 p.m. The sun had gone down hours ago, and the temperature had dropped significantly. The streets in the commercial district were mostly quiet, with only a few cars passing by. I pulled my coat tightly around my shoulders and walked the 3 blocks back toward the lot. As I approached the entrance, I could see that the lot was almost completely empty. There were maybe 4 or 5 other cars scattered around the massive dirt square, belonging to other people who were working late, but my car was the only one parked all the way in the back corner. The tall streetlights from the main road barely reached that far back. My sedan was sitting in deep shadow, silhouetted against the dark, heavy branches of the pine trees. I walked across the lot, the soft sound of my shoes stepping on the loose gravel echoing in the quiet night air. I stopped about 10 feet away from my car and pulled my key fob out of my pocket. I pressed the unlock button. The headlights flashed on briefly, casting a bright beam of light across the dirt and the chain-link fence in front of the bumper. Everything looked completely normal. My car was untouched. There were no broken windows and nothing looked out of place. I walked up to the driver's side and reached out to grab the door handle. That was when I noticed the ground. Because of the heavy rain from the night before, the dirt beneath the loose gravel was still soft and muddy. Right next to my front tire, illuminated slightly by the ambient light from the street, I saw a clear set of footprints pressed deeply into the mud. Something felt off. I slowly pulled my hand away from the door handle and looked down. They were large, heavy boot prints with thick treads. I looked at the pattern, expecting to see a trail leading from my car toward the street, like someone had just walked past my vehicle. But the footprints did not walk past. They started near the back bumper, moved slowly along the passenger side doors, and wrapped tightly around the front headlights. I took a slow step backward, my eyes tracing the dark indentations in the mud. The heavy boot prints circled my entire car in a tight, deliberate loop. They were positioned so close to the metal that whoever made them must have been brushing their heavy jacket right up against the paint. I followed the tracks as they came around the front driver's side tire. I noticed that the prints overlapped in several places. The person had not just walked around my car once. They had circled it over and over again, packing around the metal frame in the dark. I followed the final set of prints. They stopped exactly where I was standing. The last 2 boot prints were pressed deep into the soft mud, pointing directly at the driver's side window. They were positioned so incredibly close to the glass that there was barely an inch of space between the toes of the boots and the door. Whoever made them had stood right there, leaning in, looking directly into the empty driver's seat. My stomach dropped. I looked at the mud surrounding those final 2 prints. There were no tracks leading away. There was no trail walking back toward the street. There was no trail heading off toward the other cars. The heavy boot prints just circled the vehicle relentlessly, stopping right at my door, and that was it. It was as if the person had just vanished into thin air from that exact spot. I stood frozen next to my door. I realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity where the person must have gone. If there were no tracks leading away across the mud, the only place they could have stepped was backward. Backward over the short concrete parking block and straight into the dark, overgrown pine trees directly behind my car. They had just stepped back into the shadows when they heard my footsteps approaching on the gravel. I did not waste another second looking at the ground. I yanked the driver's door open, threw my briefcase into the passenger seat, and practically dove into the car. I slammed the heavy metal door shut behind me and immediately hit the master lock button. I shoved the key into the ignition and twisted it hard. The engine roared to life and my headlights turned on, illuminating the chain-link fence and the thick wall of pine trees just a few feet in front of my bumper. As the bright beams of light hit the branches, I saw something shift in the dark. The heavy lower branches of the thickest pine tree moved slightly, pushing apart. I heard a soft, slow rustling noise coming from the darkness just beyond the rusted metal fence. Someone was standing perfectly still in the dark space between the tree trunks, hiding just outside the edge of my headlights. I did not wait for them to step out. I threw the car into reverse and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. My tires spun violently in the loose gravel and mud, kicking dirt into the air as the car lurched backward. I whipped the steering wheel around, put the car in drive, and sped out of the empty lot as fast as I could. I drove all the way to my apartment, keeping my eyes glued to my rearview mirror. Every time I stopped at a red light, I expected to see someone standing behind my bumper. I did not feel safe until I was inside my apartment with the deadbolt thrown and the security chain locked in place. The next morning I left my apartment an hour early. I drove straight past the gravel lot and paid an absurd amount of money to park in a secure, well-lit parking garage 5 blocks away from my office. I refused to even drive near the dirt lot. During my lunch break that afternoon, I decided to take a walk down the street, keeping a safe distance on the opposite sidewalk. I just wanted to see the lot during the daylight. The place was completely packed. Every single space in the center and along the edges was filled with cars. Drivers were circling the narrow aisles, waiting for someone to leave. I looked toward the back corner, near the tall chain-link fence and the line of thick pine trees. The spot was completely empty again. Why do you think everyone else knew to avoid that spot? Story 6. I was working late one night at my office building, and everything felt completely normal until I noticed something that didn't make sense. My name is Elodie March. At the time, I was working as a data entry clerk for a large medical billing company. Because I was going to school during the day, I had to take the overnight shift. My schedule ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Monday through Friday. Our office was located on the 4th floor of a very old commercial building in the downtown area. During the day, the floor was packed with over 100 employees, but at night, it was essentially a ghost town. It was usually just me and 2 other overnight clerks. We were all spread out in completely different sections of the massive, open-plan office space. I rarely ever saw them unless we passed each other near the elevators. The floor was mostly silent, filled only with the low humming noise of the computer servers and the occasional creaking of the building settling. Deep in the back corner of the office, at the very end of a long, windowless hallway, there was a small employee break room. Inside the break room was an old, glass-front vending machine. I had a very specific routine to help break up the monotony of the night. Every single shift at exactly 2 a.m. I would leave my cubicle, walk down that long hallway, and go to the vending machine. I always put a dollar bill into the slot and pressed the exact same 2 buttons on the keypad, E4. That was the slot for the peanut butter crackers. I would grab my snack, sit at one of the small tables for 15 minutes, and then go right back to work. It was a Tuesday night in late October when the routine broke. At 2 a.m. I walked down the quiet, dimly lit corridor. I stepped into the break room and walked up to the vending machine. The bright white light from inside the glass case illuminated the dark room. I slid my dollar bill into the feeder. It pulled the money in and the digital display lit up green. I pushed the button for E and then the button for 4. I stood there and watched the thick metal coil on the 4th row slowly turn. Something fell from the row, but it was not the yellow package of peanut butter crackers. I heard a soft plastic crinkle as the item hit the bottom delivery tray. I reached my hand through the plastic flap and pulled it out. It was a package of red licorice. I stood there holding the red plastic wrapper. I looked closely at the E4 slot behind the thick glass. The row was still completely full of peanut butter crackers. The coil had turned, but the crackers had stayed perfectly in place. I scanned every single row and column in the machine. There was no licorice stocked anywhere. Not a single slot contained that candy. I felt a little uneasy. It was weird, but vending machines are notoriously unreliable. I tried to rationalize it. I figured the delivery driver who restocks the machine must have accidentally dropped a loose package of licorice behind the glass, and the turning coil had simply bumped it down into the tray. It was a perfectly logical explanation. I left the licorice on the table and walked back to my desk, trying not to think about it. The next night, Wednesday, I took my break at exactly 2 a.m. The office was freezing cold that night. I wrapped my cardigan tightly around myself and walked down the long, empty hallway toward the break room. I walked up to the machine, took a dollar bill out of my pocket, and fed it into the slot. The digital screen turned green. I hesitated for a second, but then I pressed E4. I watched the coil turn. This time, the item that fell did not sound like a plastic wrapper. I heard a heavy, metallic clanking noise hit the bottom of the delivery tray. It sounded like a piece of dense metal striking the hard plastic. My stomach dropped. I stood there, staring at the dark rectangular opening of the delivery tray. I did not want to stick my hand inside. I slowly leaned down, pushed the plastic flap back with my fingertips, and reached into the darkness. My hand brushed against something freezing cold and solid. I grabbed it and pulled it out into the light. It was a thick, heavy iron padlock. It had no brand name on it, and the metal was deeply scratched and rusted. It felt incredibly heavy in the palm of my hand. I looked up at the glass display. The E4 coil had completely finished its rotation, but the front package of peanut butter crackers had not moved an inch. The machine had not dropped a snack. It had dropped a heavy metal lock. I checked the sides of the vending machine. I pressed my face against the glass, looking for any open compartments or signs that someone had tampered with it. But the large metal door was locked tight. There was absolutely no way something that heavy and large could just fall from the internal dispensing mechanism on its own. It had to have been deliberately placed right on the edge of the chute. I threw the heavy lock straight into the break room trash can and walked quickly back to my desk. I spent the rest of my shift feeling incredibly paranoid. Every time I heard the faint settling noises of the building, I would look over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the dark aisles of the cubicles. By Thursday night, I was exhausted from a lack of sleep and highly on edge. I made a firm decision that I was not going to go anywhere near the break room. I sat at my desk and focused entirely on my data entry. Around 3:30 a.m., my throat was feeling completely dry. I tried to ignore it, but I eventually realized I needed a drink. I decided I would just get a quick bottle of water from the top row of the machine and completely avoid the snack rows. I would be in and out in less than 30 seconds. I walked down the quiet corridor. The silence in the building felt heavy and suffocating. I stepped into the break room, pulled a dollar bill from my pocket, and slid it into the machine. I reached my hand out to press the button for A1, which was the water slot. Before my finger could even press the plastic button, the red digital screen beeped loudly on its own. The bright red numbers flashed across the display, E4. I froze completely. I had not touched the keypad. My hand was hovering 2 inches away from it. I watched in total silence as the metal coil on row E4 began to slowly turn. It completed a full rotation. Something very small and flat slipped out from underneath the bottom of the peanut butter crackers. It fluttered down through the air and landed in the dark delivery tray without making a single sound. I felt completely exposed standing alone in that bright room. I did not want to reach into the tray. I just wanted to turn around and walk away. But I was terrified, and I needed to know what the machine had just given me. I slowly reached my hand through the plastic flap and felt the bottom of the tray. I touched a small, glossy piece of paper. I pulled it out and turned it over under the fluorescent light. It was a Polaroid photograph. The lighting in the picture was dark, but it was clear enough for me to see exactly what it was. It was a picture of me. I was standing directly in front of the vending machine, looking at the glass. My arm was reaching out toward the keypad. It had been taken from the dark hallway directly behind me. I stared at the glossy paper. The clothes I was wearing in the photo were the exact same sweater and jeans I was wearing right now. The picture had been taken just moments ago while I was walking up to the machine. My breathing became fast and shallow. I realized that the photo had to have been slipped into the back of the machine, resting right on the edge of the glass, waiting for the electronic mechanism to push it forward, and whoever took the picture was still in the building with me. While I was standing there staring at the photo, I heard a sound coming from the dark corridor behind me. It was a slow, scraping noise. It sounded like the heavy rubber sole of a shoe dragging softly against the linoleum floor. It was getting closer to the break room entrance. I did not turn around to look. I dropped the photograph on the floor, bolted out of the secondary break room door, and ran down the opposite end of the hallway toward the emergency stairwell. I threw the heavy metal door open, ran down 3 full flights of stairs, and locked myself inside the lobby security office with the overnight guard. The guard immediately called the police, and they thoroughly searched the entire 4th floor. They did not find anyone. The building was completely empty. They checked the break room, but the Polaroid photo was gone from the floor where I had dropped it. The officers told me I had probably just gotten spooked by a reflection or an old piece of trash left behind by the day shift. But I know what I saw in that photo. I never went back to that building. I called my manager the next morning and quit over the phone. A few weeks later, one of the other overnight clerks texted me to ask how my new job search was going. During the conversation, he casually mentioned that the vending machine in the break room had been entirely removed by building management. He said someone had shattered the front glass over the weekend, and when maintenance came to clean it up, they found a massive pile of rusted iron padlocks shoved deep into the bottom delivery tray. Who do you think was changing the machine selection? Story 7. It was the first winter I spent completely alone in my top-floor apartment. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. My name is Garrett Knoll. I work remotely doing data analysis for a logistics company, which means I spend the vast majority of my time inside my apartment. After dealing with noisy, inconsiderate roommates throughout my early 20s, I had finally saved up enough money to afford my own place. I specifically sought out a top-floor unit in a quiet part of the city. I was entirely exhausted by the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through my ceiling at all hours of the night. I just wanted absolute, uninterrupted quiet. I found a relatively affordable one-bedroom apartment on the 6th floor of an older brick building. The layout of the unit was very narrow and straightforward. When you walked through the heavy front door, you immediately entered the living room with a small galley kitchen attached to the right. A short, carpeted hallway led past a bathroom and straight into the bedroom at the very back of the unit. Because the building was constructed in the 1970s, the ceilings were covered in a thick, textured popcorn plaster. There was one specific detail about the living room that caught my attention when I first moved in. Located exactly in the center of the living room ceiling was a square wooden access panel, roughly 2 feet wide. It was painted flat white to blend in with the surrounding plaster. The leasing agent had casually mentioned it was just a maintenance hatch for plumbers to access the main water lines in an emergency. For the first few weeks, the apartment was perfect. The top floor was completely isolated, and I never heard a single sound from the neighboring units. It was a Tuesday night in late November when the pattern started. I was sitting on my living room couch around 11:30 p.m. The weather outside was freezing, and a light snow had started to fall, blanketing the city streets and dampening the outside noise. I was watching a documentary on my television with the volume turned down low. Suddenly I heard a single, heavy thumping sound. It came from directly above me, right over the center of the living room ceiling. It was not a sharp, cracking noise like settling wood. It sounded exactly like a 50-pound bag of wet sand being dropped flat onto the floorboards. The impact was so deep and structural that I actually saw the surface of the water in my drinking glass vibrate on the coffee table. I immediately muted the television. I sat perfectly still on the couch, staring up at the popcorn ceiling, listening intensely. I fully expected to hear the sound of heavy work boots walking across the roof, assuming maybe the building maintenance crew was doing an emergency repair. I waited in the absolute silence for 10 solid minutes. There was not another sound. There were no footsteps, no scraping tools, and no voices, just that one heavy impact and then total silence. I felt a little uneasy, but I brushed it off. I rationalized that it was probably just a large buildup of ice falling from a nearby tree branch onto the flat roof of the building. I turned the television off and went to bed. 2 nights later, on Thursday, I was lying in my bed reading a book. It was slightly past 1 in the morning. The bedroom was completely dark except for the small circle of light cast by my bedside lamp. The building was completely dead. As I reached over to turn the page of my book, I heard the exact same sound. It was a single, massive dropping noise, but this time it was not over the living room. It sounded like it was directly above my bed. My stomach dropped. I froze with my hand hovering in the air. The impact sounded incredibly close and localized. It did not sound like it was coming from the exterior of the roof. It sounded muffled, as if the heavy object was resting inside the actual space between my ceiling and the roof of the building. I lay entirely motionless on my mattress. I stared straight up into the darkness above my bed, tracking the exact spot where the sound had originated. I waited for a follow-up noise. I waited for over an hour, my breathing shallow, listening for any sign of movement. Absolutely nothing happened. It was just one single shift of dead weight, followed by hours of unnatural, heavy silence. The next morning, I was feeling incredibly paranoid. I walked down the 6 flights of stairs to the lobby and went straight to the building manager's office. I asked him if there had been any contractors working on the roof late at night, or if there was any chance a large animal like a raccoon could have gotten into the attic. The manager shook his head. He explained that nobody had been up on the roof in several months. He then told me something that made my chest feel tight. He explained that the building did not actually have an attic. Because it had a flat tar roof, the space between my plaster ceiling and the exterior roof was just a dark, shallow crawl space. He said it was barely 3 feet high, filled entirely with thick sheets of fiberglass insulation and old electrical conduits. He assured me no animals could get in because the exterior roof hatch was made of solid steel and permanently padlocked from the outside. He explicitly stated that the absolute only way to access that dark, cramped crawl space was through the square wooden panel located in my living room ceiling. I thanked him, walked back up to my floor, and locked my deadbolt behind me. I stood in the center of my living room and stared up at the white wooden panel. It was completely flush with the ceiling, perfectly seated in its frame. It looked entirely untouched. I tried to convince myself that I was just being overly anxious about old pipes expanding in the freezing temperatures. That night, I refused to sleep in my bedroom. I brought a blanket out to the living room couch. I turned off every single light in the apartment, wrapped myself in the blanket, and sat in the pitch black. I wanted to hear exactly where the noise was coming from. I sat there in the silence, watching the digital clock on my microwave slowly change. At exactly 2:15 a.m., the silence broke. I heard a heavy, dull thumping sound. It was positioned directly over the kitchen area at the far right side of the apartment. I held my breath and kept my eyes locked on the dark ceiling. Exactly 5 minutes later, I heard a second sound. It was another heavy impact, but it was slightly closer to the living room. It was not a footstep. It sounded like a massive, dense object forcefully shifting its weight forward in the cramped space. It sounded exactly like something incredibly heavy was pulling itself along the wooden ceiling joists, dragging its mass forward, and then dropping heavily back down onto the drywall. Something felt terribly wrong. My heart began to pound violently against my ribs. I sat completely frozen in the dark. 5 more minutes passed in total silence. Then another heavy, dragging impact sounded. It was directly over the short hallway that led to the bedroom. Whatever was up there was actively moving. It was moving slowly, deliberately, taking massive pauses of absolute silence between every single shift in position. I tracked the movements in my head as I sat in the dark. Another 5 minutes passed. Then, a deep, heavy noise sounded directly over the bedroom at the very back of the unit. It had traversed the entire length of the apartment. It was positioning itself perfectly over my mattress, exactly where I would normally be sleeping at that hour. I realized with a sickening clarity that if I had been in my bed, this heavy mass would be resting directly above my face, separated by just a thin layer of old plaster. The apartment went completely silent. I sat rigid on the couch for 2 full hours. The digital clock rolled over to 4:30 a.m. I started to feel a painful cramp developing in my leg from sitting entirely motionless for so long. I desperately hoped that whatever was up there had finally settled for the night. I slowly pushed the blanket off my shoulders and stood up from the couch, making sure not to make a single sound. As soon as my foot pressed into the carpet, a noise directly above me made me freeze completely. It was not over the bedroom anymore. It was a heavy, gritty scraping sound directly above the living room. It was right above my head. I slowly tilted my head back and looked straight up. The faint orange light from the street lamp outside my window illuminated the ceiling just enough for me to clearly see the white wooden access panel. As I watched, I heard a slow, deliberate sliding noise. A fine shower of white plaster dust drifted down from the edges of the panel, floating through the dim orange light. The heavy wooden square was slowly being pushed upward from the other side. I watched in absolute horror as the panel lifted entirely out of its frame. It was pushed slightly to the side, creating a 2-inch dark gap between the wood and the ceiling. The pitch-black emptiness of the crawl space above was clearly visible. I did not wait to see what was going to look down through that gap. I quietly backed away from the couch. I did not turn my back to the ceiling. I reached out, grabbed my car keys off the kitchen counter, and slipped silently out the front door. I pulled the heavy fire door shut, ran down the 6 flights of concrete stairs as fast as I could, and got straight into my car. I drove to a well-lit gas station on the other side of the city and sat in my locked vehicle until the sun finally came up. I never spent another night in that apartment. I went back late the next afternoon with 3 of my friends to pack up all my belongings. When we walked through the front door and entered the living room, I stopped completely dead in my tracks. The white wooden panel was completely missing from the ceiling. It was nowhere to be found inside the apartment. There was just a massive, dark, open square hole staring down directly at the living room couch. I broke my lease that same day and moved back in with my parents until I could find a new apartment on the ground floor. How long do you think that person was living in the dark crawl space before I finally noticed the sounds? Story 8. I remember that night clearly because nothing unusual was supposed to happen at that rural gas station, but it did. My name is Talia Vance. At the time I was working as a floor nurse at a large regional hospital. My shifts were incredibly long, demanding, and physically exhausting. Because of a severe staffing shortage that week, I had been asked by management to stay late and cover a double shift. By the time I finally clocked out and walked to my car in the cold employee parking garage, it was already well past midnight. All I wanted to do was get back to my apartment, take a hot shower, and sleep for the next 12 hours. My apartment was located about 45 minutes away from the hospital, mostly connected by a long, winding stretch of dark county highway. It is a very isolated road. There are no streetlights, no residential houses, and absolutely no traffic that late at night. I usually make a strict point to keep my gas tank completely full before making that drive, but my schedule had been so chaotic that I had completely forgot to check my dashboard before leaving the city. About 20 minutes into the dark drive, my car chimed loudly. I looked down and saw the bright yellow low-fuel indicator glowing on the digital display. My needle was resting heavily on the empty line. I knew I could not make it the rest of the way home. I had to pull over immediately. A few miles down the road, I saw the bright, towering sign of an independent gas station illuminating the dark pine trees. I took the exit and pulled into the concrete lot. The station was completely deserted. The large fluorescent lights under the main canopy were buzzing loudly, casting a harsh white glare over the 4 older pump islands. I looked over at the small convenience store building. The lights inside were completely shut off, and a heavy metal security gate was pulled down over the front glass doors. It was closed for the night, but the digital screens on the pumps were glowing, indicating that the credit card readers were still active. I pulled my car up to pump number 4, which was the island located furthest away from the main road, right near the edge of the dark property line. I put the car in park, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the freezing night air. The wind was blowing hard across the lot, rustling the thick branches of the trees just beyond the concrete. The silence in the lot felt incredibly heavy. I walked up to the machine, pulled my credit card from my jacket pocket, and pushed it into the reader. The digital screen prompted me for my zip code. I typed it in, pressed the physical button for the regular grade, and grabbed the heavy black nozzle. I placed it into my gas tank and squeezed the metal handle to start the flow. I could hear the familiar, heavy rushing sound of the fuel moving through the thick rubber hose. I turned my back to the pump, wrapping my arms around myself to stay warm, and stared out at the empty highway. I just wanted the tank to fill quickly so I could get back into my heated car. Suddenly, after maybe 10 seconds, the rushing sound of the fuel stopped completely. I turned around, confused. My tank was completely empty, so there was no way it was already full. I looked down at the digital screen. Instead of showing the couple of gallons I had just pumped, the screen was completely blank for a split second. Then it flashed green and read $0 and 0 gallons. It had completely reset itself mid-use. I felt slightly annoyed. I assumed it was just a computer glitch. The pump looked incredibly old and the plastic keypad was worn down. I pulled the nozzle out of my car, placed it back into the plastic holster on the machine, and pulled my credit card out again. I swiped it a second time, punched in my zip code, selected the regular grade, and squeezed the handle. The pump engaged and the gas started flowing again. This time I did not turn around to look at the road. I kept my eyes completely locked on the small digital screen, watching the numbers climb. 1 gallon, 2 gallons. At exactly 2.5 gallons, I heard a sound. It was a soft, physical clicking noise. It sounded like it came directly from the plastic keypad right beneath the screen. The very second I heard the click, the numbers on the screen dropped instantly back to 0. The flow of fuel cut off violently, making the heavy hose jerk in my hand. My grip was still firmly squeezed on the handle. I had not moved an inch. Pumps do not just mechanically reset themselves during an active flow twice in a row. I felt uneasy. I slowly released the metal handle and hung the nozzle back up on the machine. I stood there on the cold concrete looking around the empty lot. The bright canopy lights made the darkness beyond the property look like a solid black wall. There were no other cars. There was no movement near the closed convenience store. I was completely alone in the silence. Something felt off. I looked at my fuel gauge through the car window. My tank was barely a quarter full. I still had over 20 miles of dark highway left to drive. I knew I had to try one last time. If it failed again, I was going to move my car to a completely different pump. I pulled my card out and swiped it through the reader for the 3rd time. The machine beeped, accepting the card. I typed in my zip code and pressed the button for the regular grade. But this time, before I even reached out to grab the nozzle, I heard a loud, heavy mechanical clank from deep inside the pump housing. I did not touch the machine. I took a slow step backward. Suddenly, the pump started running on its own. My stomach dropped. I stood perfectly still on the cold concrete, watching in total disbelief as the digital numbers on the screen began to spin rapidly upward. 1 gallon, 2 gallons, 3 gallons. The price was climbing incredibly fast. I could hear the intense, heavy sound of fuel rushing aggressively through a hose, but I looked down at the nozzle for my side of the pump. It was resting perfectly still in its plastic holster. No gas was going into my car. The machine was actively dispensing fuel, charging my card, but my hose was completely dormant. I listened closely to the rushing noise. It was not coming from inside the metal housing. It was coming from the exact opposite side of the large metal pillar. Pump number 4 shared a central structure with pump number 3. I slowly backed away from my car door. The pump island was wide, separated in the middle by a large plastic advertisement board that displayed a faded picture of a coffee cup. Between the edge of that plastic board and the thick metal frame of the pump, there was a very narrow vertical gap, maybe an inch wide. I carefully walked toward the edge of the concrete island. I did not want to walk all the way around to the other side. I just leaned forward and looked directly through that tiny vertical gap to see what was happening on the opposite side of the machine. The heavy black hose on the other side was pulled taut, stretching down toward the concrete. I looked slightly higher. Pressed completely flat against the metal framework, standing entirely inside the dark shadow cast by the advertisement board, was a tall man wearing a heavy, dark winter coat. He was completely motionless. He was holding the premium nozzle from his side with one hand, pointing it directly into a massive red plastic fuel container resting on the ground. His other arm was reaching perfectly around the corner of the metal frame, his finger resting lightly on the red cancel button on my keypad. He had been standing there the entire time, completely hidden in the blind spot of the pump structure. He was deliberately canceling my transaction mid-flow, waiting for me to swipe my card again out of pure frustration. The moment I authorized the third transaction, he squeezed his nozzle before I could grab mine, forcing the machine to divert the authorized fuel to his side. But the mechanical theft was not what made me freeze in terror. As I leaned in and looked through that narrow gap in the frame, I realized his head was not turned down toward the heavy red container he was filling. His face was pressed right up against the cold metal. He was looking straight through the narrow gap, staring directly into my eyes. He had been watching me the entire time. I did not scream, I did not say a single word. I violently ripped my gaze away, spun around, and sprinted back to the driver's door of my car. I threw myself into the seat, slammed the heavy metal door shut, and instantly hit the master lock button. My hands were shaking so severely I could barely turn the ignition. I shoved the car into drive and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. My tires shrieked against the concrete lot as I sped out from under the fluorescent canopy and merged recklessly onto the dark highway. I drove 20 miles over the speed limit until I finally reached my apartment building. I locked myself inside and immediately called my credit card company to report the card stolen and cancel the transaction. I never took that rural highway home at night ever again. How many other people do you think he did that to before I finally stepped back and watched the screen? Story 9. I was alone at the office, which wasn't unusual, but something about that night just felt different. My name is Everett Klein. I work as a senior risk analyst for a large corporate insurance firm. My job is entirely desk-based and incredibly repetitive. I spend 8 to 10 hours a day staring at complex spreadsheets, verifying policy numbers, and reviewing dense financial documents. Our office takes up the entire 7th floor of a massive commercial building in the business district. It is a completely open-plan layout, consisting of dozens of identical gray cubicles, separated by low, blue fabric walls. Because my workload is usually heavier than the rest of my team, I am accustomed to staying much later than my coworkers. By 6 p.m., the floor is usually completely abandoned. I actually prefer the quiet. It allows me to focus without the constant background noise of ringing telephones and cross-cubicle conversations. I'm a very methodical person, and I'm incredibly particular about how I organize my personal workspace. I do not use digital planners or smartphone apps to track my deadlines. Instead, I keep a massive paper blotter calendar sitting right in the center of my desk, positioned directly beneath my keyboard. It is one of those large, flat calendars with thick, heavy white pages and large 2-inch empty squares for every day of the month. I use a standard, company-issued black ballpoint pen to write down my daily tasks. At the end of every single shift, before I leave the building, I place my pen perfectly parallel to the top edge of the calendar. It is just a harmless, obsessive habit I have developed over the years. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when I first noticed something was wrong. I arrived at the office around 8 a.m., set my travel coffee mug down on a coaster, and looked at my calendar to check my tasks for the day. Inside the blank square for Thursday the 14th, there was a small, distinct mark. I leaned in closer to look at it. It was a heavy black dot. It looked exactly like someone had taken a pen, pressed the tip firmly into the thick paper, and held it there for a few seconds. The ink had bled slightly outward into the white fibers of the page. I felt a little confused. I did not remember making any mistakes or accidentally dropping my pen on that specific date. I figured I must have just rested the pen there without realizing it while I was distracted on a long phone call the day before. I completely ignored it, opened my email, and went about my normal day. By Friday morning, the situation escalated. I was the first person to arrive in my section of the floor. I walked down the long, gray carpeted aisle, sat down in my rolling chair, and immediately looked down at the blotter calendar. My stomach tightened slightly. Inside the box for Wednesday the 20th, there was a new mark, but it was not just a single dot this time. It was a faint, jagged line curved into the shape of a half circle. The ink was the exact same dark black as the standard ballpoint pens our company provides. I reached out and ran my index finger over the mark. I could feel a deep physical indentation in the paper. Whoever drew it had pressed down incredibly hard, carving a groove into the heavy page. Something felt off. My cubicle is located in a back corner of the floor, very far away from the main walkways, the printers, and the employee break room. There was absolutely no logical reason for any of my coworkers to be standing at my specific desk, leaning directly over my keyboard, and scribbling randomly on my personal calendar. When my coworkers started arriving, I stood up and asked the guy who sits in the cubicle directly next to mine if he had borrowed a pen from my desk after I left the night before. He looked at me like I was crazy and explicitly stated that he had left the office at 5 p.m. sharp. I felt very uneasy, but I did not want to sound paranoid over a few stray ink marks. I tried to convince myself that maybe the overnight cleaning crew had bumped my desk while vacuuming. The weekend passed and I managed to put the weird marks out of my mind. But when I came into work early on Monday morning, the calendar had been targeted again. This time it was undeniable. Inside the square for Friday the 29th, someone had drawn a completely closed, dark circle. They had traced the circular shape over and over again, maybe 5 or 6 times. The pressure applied to the pen was so severe that the top layer of the thick paper had actually started to tear and peel away. The black ink was smeared heavily and aggressively around the torn edges. I looked at the top edge of my calendar. My standard black ballpoint pen was sitting right there on the paper, but it was not placed perfectly parallel like I always leave it. It was resting at a slight, uneven angle. Someone had stood in my cubicle and used my own pen to aggressively vandalize my calendar over the weekend. I felt incredibly frustrated, and the feeling of my personal space being violated made me highly uncomfortable. I strongly considered reporting it to building security, but complaining about ink circles on a paper desk calendar felt ridiculous. I decided I would just start putting my pen away in my locked drawer every night before I left. That Thursday, our department was hit with a massive quarterly audit. The workload was immediately overwhelming. I knew I was going to have to stay very late to finish verifying the assigned reports. By 7 p.m., the last of my coworkers had packed up their briefcases and headed for the elevators. I watched them walk away, and then the heavy glass doors to our floor clicked shut. I was completely alone on the 7th floor. The building transitions to a low-power mode after hours to save electricity. The overhead fluorescent lights above the empty sections of cubicles automatically shut off, leaving only the lights directly above my specific aisle illuminated. The hum of the central air conditioning completely cut out. The silence in the massive, open room felt incredibly heavy and unnatural. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of traffic from the street far below, but inside the office, it was completely dead quiet. I put my noise-canceling headphones on, played some instrumental music, and focused entirely on my dual monitors. I typed steadily for hours, entering data and verifying policy numbers. I was completely locked into my work, ignoring the dark, empty office surrounding me. Around 9:30 p.m., I finally finished the last report. I took off my headphones, laid them on the desk, and rubbed my tired eyes. I leaned back heavily in my rolling chair, stretching my arms high over my head. The office was perfectly still. As I sat there stretching, I heard a sound. It was a slow, deliberate scratching noise. It sounded exactly like the rough friction of a ballpoint pen dragging forcefully across thick paper. I froze completely. I held my breath. The sound was not echoing from another cubicle across the room. It was not coming from the hallway. It was coming from directly in front of me. I slowly lowered my arms and looked down at my desk. My black pen was sitting perfectly still inside my plastic pencil cup, exactly where I had put it hours ago. My hands were resting on the armrests of my chair. But the calendar was changing. Right in the middle of the large, empty square for that exact day's date, the thick white paper was physically bending. I watched in absolute horror as a deep, sharp indentation began to form in the fibers of the page. It started as a single point, pressing down so incredibly hard that the paper strained and whitened around the microscopic center. Then the invisible pressure began to move. I heard the slow scratching noise again as the deep groove dragged slowly to the right, curving downward. It was carving a perfect, jagged circle into the paper directly in front of my eyes. There was no pen, there was no hand, there was absolutely nothing hovering over the desk, but the thick paper was tearing and folding inward under the immense, concentrated pressure of an invisible point. My stomach dropped, the scratching sound was so loud in the silent office. I sat entirely paralyzed, my eyes glued to the calendar. The invisible point completed the first circle. Without pausing, the scratching noise grew louder as it immediately started tracing over the exact same circle a second time, pressing even deeper into the blotter. The paper let out a soft tearing sound as the top layer began to rip under the sheer force. I did not wait to see what would happen when it finished. I shoved my rolling chair backwards so violently that it slammed hard into the fabric wall of my cubicle. I reached out, grabbed my car keys off the corner of the desk, turned around, and sprinted down the main aisle toward the exit. I did not look back at my desk. I ran through the dark sections of the floor, shoved the heavy glass doors open, and slammed my hand aggressively against the elevator button. I stood there trembling in the dim lobby until the doors finally opened. I drove straight to my apartment, locked my deadbolt, and left all the lights on until morning. The next day, I called my department manager and told him I had a family emergency and needed to work remotely for the rest of the week. I never went back to that specific desk. I requested an immediate transfer to a completely different department located on the third floor of the building. I bought a brand new calendar for my new cubicle, but I still check it every single morning just to be safe. What do you think was trying to mark that date on my calendar? Story 10. I didn't realize anything was wrong at my apartment building until it was already too late. My name is Briar Sutton. I live on the top floor of an older 7-story apartment complex located just outside the city limits. The building has a very narrow, outdated layout. There's only one main hallway on each floor covered in cheap, industrial gray carpet. My specific unit is located at the very end of the 7th floor corridor. Directly across from my front door, separated by maybe 10 feet of hallway space, is the building's only elevator. Because the building is old, the elevator is incredibly loud. Whenever it arrives at a floor, a sharp, piercing digital bell rings out to signal its arrival. After the chime sounds, there is a distinct 2-second delay before the heavy metal doors begin to slide apart with a loud mechanical grinding noise. I work full-time as a freelance video editor, which means my sleep schedule is completely ruined. I'm almost always awake working at my computer until 3 or 4 in the morning. I am very used to the ambient sounds of the building at night, and I know exactly what the hallway sounds like when it is completely empty. It was a Tuesday night in early November when the pattern first started. I was sitting at my desk editing a project. It was exactly 1:30 a.m. The entire building was completely dead quiet. Suddenly, I heard the sharp, clear chime of the elevator ringing from the hallway outside my door. I subconsciously paused the video on my screen and waited. I expected to hear the heavy mechanical grinding noise of the metal doors opening, followed by the muffled sound of a neighbor's footsteps walking down the carpeted hall, but nothing happened. The chime rang loudly, and then the absolute silence returned to the corridor. The doors never opened. I sat there for a few minutes, listening closely. There were no voices, no keys jingling, and no footsteps retreating toward the emergency stairwell. I just figured a resident on the ground floor had accidentally pressed the call button, realized their mistake, and walked away, sending an empty car all the way up to the top floor for no reason. It was slightly annoying, but I brushed it off and went back to my editing. The following night, the weather took a turn for the worse. A heavy rainstorm was hitting the city, drumming loudly against my living room windows. I was working at my desk again. At exactly 2:15 a.m., the elevator chime rang out in the hallway. I immediately stopped typing. I kept my eyes on my monitor but listened intently. Just like the night before, the digital bell echoed through the thin wood of my front door, but the mechanical grinding of the doors never followed. Total silence. I felt a little uneasy. I tried to rationalize it again. but exactly 20 minutes later at 2:35 a.m., the chime rang a second time. Something felt off. If someone had called the elevator from the lobby, the car would have traveled all the way down. If the car was already sitting completely dormant on my floor, it would not chime again on its own. The only way the digital bell triggers when the car is already stationary on a floor is if someone is physically inside the small metal box, pressing the button for that specific floor over and over again. I slowly pushed my rolling chair back from my desk, walked over to my front door, and pressed my eye against the small glass peephole. I had a direct, unobstructed view of the elevator directly across the hallway. The red digital floor indicator above the thick metal frame was glowing brightly in the dim fluorescent light. It displayed the number 7. The elevator was sitting right there, but the heavy metal doors were shut completely tight. The hallway was entirely empty. I stood at my door for over 10 minutes, just watching the red number through the distorted glass. Nothing happened. The doors did not open and the car did not move to another floor. I eventually checked my deadbolt, made sure the security chain was fastened, and went to bed feeling highly paranoid. By Thursday night, the situation had been bothering me all day. I could not shake the feeling that the empty hallway was not actually empty. I decided I was not going to work that night. I turned off every single light in my apartment, sat on the edge of my living room couch in the pitch black, and just listened to the silence of the building. The first few hours passed slowly. The rain had stopped and the city was completely quiet. I watched the digital clock on my television set top box slowly roll over. At exactly 3 a.m., the silence broke. The sharp, piercing chime of the elevator echoed violently through my living room. My stomach dropped. I instantly stood up from the couch, walked silently across the hardwood floor, and pressed my face against the front door. I looked through the peephole. The red number 7 was glowing. The metal doors were shut tight. The carpeted hallway was completely desolate. I held my breath and waited. 5 minutes passed in absolute silence. Then the chime rang again. It was incredibly loud. It was not a glitch, and it was not a mechanical error. Someone was actively playing with the control panel inside that car. My frustration suddenly outweighed my fear. I was exhausted, and I wanted the noise to stop. I convinced myself that it was probably just a group of teenagers who had snuck into the building and were messing around in the elevator, trying to scare the top-floor residents. I made an incredibly stupid decision. I unlocked my deadbolt, unlatched the security chain, and pulled my front door open. I stepped out into the hallway. The air in the corridor was freezing cold. The only illumination came from the single flickering fluorescent light fixture mounted directly above the elevator frame. I left my apartment door cracked open slightly behind me, slowly walking the 10 feet across the gray carpet. I stopped directly in front of the heavy, dark metal doors. I looked up at the red digital display. The car was definitely resting right in front of me, separated by just a few inches of thick steel. As I stood there in the heavy silence, I heard a sound. It was not coming from down the hall. It was coming from the other side of the metal doors, deep inside the small elevator car. It was a slow, wet squeaking sound. It sounded exactly like the thick rubber sole of a heavy work boot deliberately shifting its weight against the linoleum floor. My breathing became incredibly shallow. There was definitely someone standing inside the dark, confined space. I did not say a word. I just stood completely frozen, staring at the center crease of the metal doors. Suddenly I heard another sound. It was a low, strained electrical hum. It sounded like the heavy motor of the elevator doors trying to engage, but being physically restrained. The sharp digital chime suddenly blasted right in my face. The volume was absolutely deafening from less than 2 feet away. I physically flinched backward. The digital bell stopped ringing, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in the hallway, but the metal doors still did not move. I stared at the thick steel, and a sudden, horrifying realization hit me. I finally understood why the doors were not opening. The elevator was not broken. The person standing inside was standing directly in front of the control panel, pressing the button for the 7th floor over and over again to manually trigger the arrival chime. But at the exact same time, they were planting their boots on the floor and physically bracing their entire body weight against the center of the metal doors, forcefully holding them shut from the inside while the motor strained to pull them apart. They were intentionally making noise in the dead of the night, ringing the bell over and over, just waiting to see if anyone on the isolated top floor would be foolish enough to come out of their apartment to investigate. And I had just walked right up to the door. While I was standing there paralyzed with fear, the low, strained electrical hum suddenly stopped. The wet squeaking sound inside the car shifted forward. I heard the heavy, metallic click of the locking mechanism releasing. The person inside was letting go of the doors. I did not wait to see the metal slide apart. I violently spun around, sprinted the short distance back to my apartment, threw myself completely inside, and slammed the heavy wooden door shut. I instantly twisted the deadbolt, threw the heavy chain lock into place, and pressed my eye directly against the peephole. My hands were shaking so severely I had to brace them against the wood. Through the distorted glass lens, I watched the heavy elevator doors slowly grind open. The bright, harsh fluorescent light from inside the small car spilled out into the dim hallway. A very tall man wearing a dark, filthy hooded sweatshirt stepped slowly out of the elevator. He did not walk toward the emergency stairs. He did not look casually down the hallway. He immediately turned his entire body and stared directly at my front door. He knew exactly which unit had just slammed shut. He slowly walked across the gray carpet, stopping just inches away from the outside of my door. The distorted glass of the peephole filled completely with the dark, rough fabric of his hood. I could not see his face, but I could hear the slow, heavy sound of his breathing on the other side of the wood. I held my breath, absolutely terrified that he would hear me standing right there. He stood perfectly still in the hallway for over 5 minutes in complete and total silence. He did not knock, he did not try the handle. He just stood there, staring directly at the peephole. Then very slowly I heard the rubber squeak of his boots turn around. He walked back into the elevator, and the heavy metal doors ground shut behind him. I broke my lease and moved out of that building at the end of the month, but every single night until I left, I refused to sleep. I would sit in the dark on my living room couch, completely silent, and listen as that elevator chime rang loudly from the empty hallway at exactly 3 in the morning. Why do you think he was trying to bait someone out of their apartment at that hour? Story 11. It was around the halfway point of my drive home when I first started noticing something was off, and it only got worse from there. My name is Jonas Meyer. I work as a heavy machinery operator at an industrial lumber yard. Because of the constant demand, the facility runs 24 hours a day, and I am permanently assigned to the late evening shift. I usually clock out of work right around midnight. By the time I walk across the massive gravel parking lot and get into my car, I am completely physically exhausted. I live a few towns over from the lumber yard, which means my commute is a solid 45 minutes. The route I have to take is almost entirely made up of rural county roads. It is a long, winding 2-lane highway that cuts directly through a very dense, heavy state forest. There are absolutely no streetlights out there, no gas stations, and almost zero residential houses. Once you enter the tree line, it is just miles and miles of thick pine trees pressing right up against the edge of the asphalt. I drive an older 4-door sedan. It has a lot of miles on it, and the interior is pretty small and cramped. It was a Thursday night in late October. The temperature had dropped near freezing, and a thick, heavy fog was starting to roll in across the highway, making visibility incredibly poor. When I first got to my car in the employee lot, I noticed something slightly annoying. The back passenger side window was rolled down about 2 inches. I never leave my windows cracked, especially in the winter, so I figured I must have accidentally bumped the switch with my elbow when I parked that afternoon. I started the engine, rolled the window completely up, locked all the doors from the driver's console, and pulled out onto the dark road. The first 20 minutes of the drive were completely normal. I had the heater blasting, and I was listening to a sports radio station on a low volume. The road was completely dead. I had not passed a single set of headlights since leaving the lumber yard. The darkness outside was absolute, broken only by the yellow beams of my own headlights illuminating the fog just a few feet ahead of my bumper. I was taking a long, slow curve in the road when I naturally glanced up at my rearview mirror to check the lane behind me. In the dim, ambient light bouncing off the trees, I saw a quick, dark movement in the back seat. It looked exactly like a heavy shadow shifting from the middle of the seat over toward the passenger side door. I immediately turned my head and looked over my right shoulder. There was nothing there. The back seat was completely empty. I could clearly see the gray fabric of the upholstery and the outlines of the 2 rear headrests. There was nobody sitting in the back of my car. I turned my head back to the road and tried to rationalize it. The lighting inside the car was terrible. The only illumination was the faint green glow coming from my dashboard console. I figured the movement was just a trick of the light, probably the shadow of a tall pine tree passing over the rear window as I rounded the curve. I adjusted my posture in the driver's seat, turned the volume up on the radio slightly, and kept driving. About 10 minutes later, I was driving down a completely straight stretch of road. The fog was getting thicker. Out of pure habit, my eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror again. I saw it again. This time the movement was much slower and more deliberate. It was a massive, dark shape shifting directly behind the passenger seat, lowering itself down below the window line. My stomach dropped. I instantly whipped my head around and stared into the back seat. The car swerved slightly on the asphalt as I took my eyes off the road. The back seat was completely empty. I stared at the gray fabric for several seconds, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no shape, there was no person, just the empty space and the seatbelts hanging from the ceiling. I turned back around, gripped the steering wheel incredibly hard, and forced the car back into the center of the lane. I felt very uneasy. I knew what I had seen in the mirror, but my own eyes were telling me the car was empty. I started scanning my brain, trying to find a logical explanation. I told myself that my eyes were just heavy from a long shift. I was tired, and the repetitive motion of the dark trees passing by in the fog was just causing my brain to create shapes out of the moving shadows. I refused to pull over. Stopping my car on the shoulder of a pitch-black, isolated road in the middle of a forest sounded like a terrible idea. I just wanted to get home and go to bed. I drove for another 5 minutes. The silence outside the car felt heavy and suffocating. I found myself staring straight ahead, actively trying not to look at the small rectangular mirror glued to my windshield. I was fighting the urge to check it. But I could not stop myself. I glanced up. A tall, dark silhouette moved from the left side of the back seat to the right. It shifted across the middle, moving incredibly fast, and then disappeared from the reflection. I threw my right arm over the passenger seat and violently twisted my entire upper body around to look in the back. Nothing. The space was completely void of any movement. The gray seats were completely undisturbed. Something felt terribly wrong. My breathing became fast and shallow. It was happening more frequently the further I drove into the woods. The disconnect between what the mirror was showing me and what was actually in the back of my car was making me feel highly paranoid. I hit the master lock button on my door panel again, just to hear the loud, heavy click of all 4 doors securing themselves. I turned the radio completely off. I needed to hear everything inside the cabin. The only sound left was the low hum of my tires rolling over the cold asphalt and the heavy blowing of the heater vents. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I was only about 10 minutes away from the edge of the forest where the town limits began. I told myself I just needed to push through and ignore the mirror. 2 minutes later, the ambient noise in the car changed. Over the sound of the tires, I heard a sound coming from directly behind me. It was a slow, heavy scraping noise. It sounded exactly like the thick, coarse fabric of a heavy winter coat dragging deliberately against the upholstery of the back seat. It was followed immediately by the distinct, creaking sound of the car's rear suspension shifting slightly, as if a massive amount of weight was being carefully transferred from the floorboards up onto the actual seat cushion. I sat completely frozen in the driver's seat. I did not turn my head around. I knew if I turned around, the back seat would be empty again. I was too terrified to look over my shoulder. I kept my face pointing straight forward. Very slowly, I shifted my eyes upward and looked directly into the rearview mirror. The back seat was no longer empty. A massive, broad-shouldered figure was sitting perfectly upright in the exact center of the rear bench. The interior of the car was too dark to make out any specific facial features, but the sheer size of the silhouette filled the entire frame of the mirror. They were wearing a heavy, dark, hooded sweatshirt pulled up over their head. They were sitting completely motionless, staring straight forward into the back of my rearview mirror, staring directly into my eyes. I did not move a muscle. I did not scream. I just kept my eyes completely locked with the dark, empty space inside the hood. The reflection in the mirror was perfectly clear. The person was real. They were sitting less than 2 feet away from the back of my head. I listened intensely to the silence in the car. Over the sound of the heater, I could hear a slow, ragged breathing noise. It was a deep, wet inhale that filled the small cabin. A freezing cold draft of air suddenly hit the back of my neck, completely overpowering the warm air from the vents. The air in the car suddenly smelled like damp earth and stale sweat. I did not turn around. I knew they were waiting for me to look over my shoulder. I kept my eyes glued to the dark reflection in the mirror, pressed my foot down heavily on the gas pedal, and floored it. The engine roared loudly and the sedan accelerated aggressively down the dark highway. The speedometer climbed to 80 miles an hour. The heavy figure in the back seat did not react to the sudden speed. They did not brace themselves or reach for a seatbelt. They just sat there, perfectly rigid, maintaining absolute eye contact with me through the small piece of glass. I drove like a maniac for the next 5 miles. I did not blink. I did not look away from the mirror for a single second. I was terrified that if I broke eye contact, the silhouette would reach forward and grab the back of my neck. Finally, the dense tree line broke. I saw the bright, towering lights of a 24-hour highway rest stop illuminating the fog about a half-mile down the road. I swerved the car violently into the massive concrete parking lot. I did not pull into a parking space. I slammed on the brakes right in front of the brightly lit glass doors of the main building. The car jerked to a violent halt. I threw the gear shift into park, unbuckled my seatbelt in one fluid motion, shoved the driver's side door open, and practically threw myself out onto the cold concrete. I hit the ground hard, scrambling away from the vehicle. I spun around, fully expecting a massive man to be climbing out of the back doors to come after me. The car doors were all completely shut. I stood under the bright fluorescent canopy lights, breathing heavily, and stared through the side windows of my sedan. The back seat was completely empty. I ran inside the rest stop and yelled for the overnight attendant to call the police. The attendant locked the front doors, and we waited inside until 2 patrol cars arrived 15 minutes later. I stood near the entrance and watched as the officers approached my vehicle with their flashlights drawn. They opened all 4 doors and thoroughly searched the entire interior. They checked the trunk. They checked under the seats. The car was entirely empty. There was no one inside. One of the officers gestured for me to walk over to the car. I slowly approached the open rear driver's side door. The officer shined his heavy flashlight down into the deep footwell located directly behind my driver's seat. He asked me if I usually left my windows open in the winter. I looked at the door. The back window was rolled down exactly 2 inches. The cold night air was blowing into the cabin. The officer shifted his flashlight beam down onto the gray carpeted floor mat. Pressed deeply into the fabric, completely hidden in the dark, cramped space where my seat was pushed back, were 2 massive, soaking wet boot prints. How did he manage to stay completely flat and out of sight on the floorboards every single time I turned my head around? Story 12. I almost didn't go to the library drop box that day, and honestly, I wish I hadn't. My name is Celine Arbor. I work from home as a freelance concept artist and illustrator for a publishing company. Because my job requires highly specific visual research, I regularly borrow massive, oversized reference books from the main city library. These are usually heavy, hardcover volumes focused on classical architecture, historical fashion, and human anatomy. My work schedule is entirely self-determined, which means I naturally fall into a very late-night routine. I prefer to run all of my errands well after midnight. The city streets are completely empty, the traffic is non-existent, and I do not have to deal with crowded parking lots. The main library is located downtown. It is an imposing, classical stone building that takes up an entire city block. Because the library closes its doors at 8 p.m., they have an after-hours return system. However, the drop box is not located near the well-lit front entrance. It is situated on the far side of the building, down a narrow, cobblestone access alleyway used mostly by maintenance workers and delivery trucks. The drop box itself is a massive, heavy-duty steel fixture embedded directly into the solid brick wall. It operates exactly like a traditional postal mailbox. You have to physically grab a thick metal handle and pull it downward with a decent amount of force, which exposes an angled metal tray. Once you place your books inside and let go of the handle, a heavy spring snaps the door shut. The floor of the tray then drops away, sending the books sliding down a long, hollow metal chute until they eventually land in a collection bin located somewhere deep inside the basement of the building. It was a Tuesday night in early November when the first strange thing happened. The weather had been terrible all week. It was freezing cold, and a steady, freezing rain was falling over the city. I pulled my car up to the curb near the library around 11:30 p.m. The streets were completely deserted. I grabbed 2 incredibly heavy art books from my passenger seat, pulled my jacket tight against the rain, and walked down the dark alleyway. The only light came from a single caged bulb mounted high up on the brick wall, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet cobblestones. I walked up to the steel box, grabbed the cold metal handle, and pulled it open. The heavy hinges squealed loudly in the quiet alley. I placed the first large book into the tray and let the handle go. It snapped shut with a loud, ringing metallic clank. I stood there for a second and listened. I could clearly hear the heavy rush of the book sliding rapidly down the hollow metal chute. A few seconds later, I heard a deep, cavernous thud as it hit the bottom of the basement bin. I pulled the handle open again, placed the second book inside, and let it shut. I listened to it slide down, heard the same heavy thud, and turned around to walk back to my car. I made it about 15 feet down the alley when I heard a sound directly behind me. It sounded exactly like the heavy steel handle of the drop box being forcefully pulled open. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still on the wet cobblestones and listened. A split second later, I heard the distinct, heavy scraping noise of a book sliding rapidly against the metal tray. It sounded exactly as if the heavy hardcover I had just deposited had been forcefully shoved back out of the chute and into the outer receiving tray. I felt a little uneasy. I turned around and looked back at the drop box. The alley was completely empty. The heavy steel door was closed flat against the brick wall. I stood there for a moment, trying to rationalize what I had just heard. I figured the heavy spring mechanism must have just echoed strangely in the damp air, or perhaps the book had gotten jammed on a structural seam and finally dropped. I walked slowly back to the brick wall. I reached out, grabbed the cold metal handle, and pulled it down. I looked inside the angled tray, fully expecting to see my book sitting there. The tray was completely empty. There was nothing but the pitch-black void of the metal chute leading down into the darkness. I let the handle snap shut, walked quickly back to my car, and drove home. I completely convinced myself that the old building just had terrible acoustics. 3 days later, on Friday night, I had to return my final batch of reference materials. It was a little past midnight. The rain had stopped, but a thick, heavy fog had rolled into the downtown area, severely limiting visibility. The city felt incredibly isolated and dead. I had 4 thick, oversized books stacked in my arms. They were incredibly heavy, and my arms were aching by the time I parked my car on the empty street. I walked down the narrow alleyway. The fog made the single bulb above the drop box look like a glowing, hazy halo against the dark brick. The air smelled like wet stone and old garbage. I just wanted to drop the books and get back into my warm car. I approached the heavy steel box. I shifted the weight of the stack into my left arm, reached out with my right hand, and pulled the thick metal handle down. The hinges groaned loudly. I took the top book off my stack, slid it into the tray, and let the handle snap shut. I stood in the damp cold and listened. I heard the rushing sound of the book sliding down the chute. I heard the loud, echoing thud as it landed in the plastic bin in the basement. Everything was completely normal. I pulled the handle open a second time. I grabbed the next massive book, pushed it firmly through the opening, and let the heavy steel door close. I stood on the cobblestones, waiting for the familiar thud. But the sound was entirely wrong. I heard the heavy book start to slide down the metal chute, but it abruptly stopped less than halfway down. Instead of a loud, echoing impact against the plastic bin, I heard a dull, soft thud. It sounded exactly like a massive, heavy object forcefully striking something solid and fleshy. My stomach dropped. I froze completely. It did not sound like it had hit a jam. It sounded like it had hit a person. The alley was absolutely silent. I stood there holding the remaining 2 books against my chest, staring intensely at the closed steel flap. Then I heard a sound coming from the other side of the brick wall. It was a slow, deliberate scraping noise. It was echoing up through the hollow metal chute. It sounded like the thick cardboard cover of the book I had just dropped was being physically dragged upward against the sheet metal. It was a strained, heavy sound, as if someone inside the dark, confined space of the slide was using an immense amount of physical effort to push the oversized book back up toward the exterior opening. Something felt terribly off. The scraping noise grew louder and more distinct. Whatever was inside that chute was getting closer to the surface. I took a slow, quiet step backward away from the brick wall. My heart was pounding violently in my chest. I did not reach for the handle. I refused to open that metal slot again. I knew exactly what the mechanics of the box meant. The only way something could move back up that chute was if they were crawling up it from the basement. I took another step backward. I carefully knelt down and placed the 2 remaining books silently on the wet cobblestones. I just wanted to leave them there and walk away. As I stood back up, the noise inside the wall suddenly stopped. The silence in the alley felt heavy and suffocating. I kept my eyes locked on the drop box, holding my breath. Very slowly, the heavy steel handle began to move. It started to pull outward on its own, fighting the heavy tension of the internal spring. The rusty hinges let out a low, agonizing squeal that echoed off the narrow brick walls. The thick metal flap opened about an inch, revealing a thin horizontal line of absolute pitch-black darkness inside the tray. Pressed tightly against the bottom edge of that narrow metal opening were 4 long, filthy, bare fingers. They were pale and covered in dark grime, curling forcefully around the sharp steel lip. Someone was crammed inside the top of the dark metal chute, gripping the edge of the receiving tray from the inside and slowly pushing the heavy door open to look out at me. I stood entirely paralyzed on the cobblestones. The metal flap opened another half-inch. From the dark, hollow void directly behind those fingers, I heard a sound that I will never forget. It was a deep, ragged, wet-breathing sound. It was heavy and strained, echoing metallic and hollow from the confined space. I did not wait to see a face appear in the gap. I violently spun around and sprinted down the dark alleyway as fast as I possibly could. I did not look back over my shoulder. I hit the street, practically threw myself into the driver's seat of my car and slammed the heavy door shut. I hit the lock button, jammed my key into the ignition, and sped away from the curb, leaving my remaining books sitting on the wet ground. I drove aimlessly for over an hour before I finally felt safe enough to go back to my apartment. I locked every single door and window and sat awake until the sun came up. The next afternoon, I called the library's main desk. I explained that I had left 2 valuable reference books sitting in the alleyway and needed to know if they had been recovered. The librarian told me they had found them that morning, completely ruined by the overnight rain. I apologized and vaguely mentioned that the drop box seemed to be malfunctioning the night before. The librarian went completely silent on the phone for several seconds. She then told me that the exterior drop box had been securely bolted shut and marked out of order for the last 3 days. She explained that the chute feeds directly into a small, windowless sub-basement storage room. Earlier that week, maintenance discovered that someone had broken into the library during the day, descended into that specific basement room, and locked the heavy steel door from the inside. They had not been able to gain access to the room since. How long do you think they were waiting inside that dark metal slide? Story 13. This happened on a cold November night. At first I thought the flickering of my porch light was just bad wiring, but it was. My name is Malcolm Reyes. I live completely alone in a small, single-story ranch house located at the very end of a quiet, residential street. The neighborhood is mostly made up of older couples and retirees, which means there's almost zero traffic or noise after the sun goes down. My house sits back pretty far from the main road at the end of a long, cracked concrete driveway. Because my property backs up directly against a dense patch of heavy woods, the front yard can get incredibly dark at night. There are no streetlights on my end of the block to illuminate the area. I work as an emergency dispatcher for the county. My shifts are long, highly stressful, and almost entirely unpredictable. I usually do not pull into my driveway until well past 11 p.m. because of the nature of my job. I take my home security very seriously. I always make sure every single window is locked, the deadbolts are thrown, and I have a very strict habit of leaving my front porch light turned on from dusk until dawn. The light itself is nothing special. It is a heavy, older brass fixture mounted directly to the exterior brick wall, located about 2 feet to the right of my heavy wooden front door. It holds a single, incredibly bright LED bulb that casts a wide, harsh orange glow across my entire front porch and a good portion of the front lawn. The physical light switch that controls the fixture is located inside my house, right on the wall in the entryway. Directly to the left of the front door is a massive, wide picture window that looks straight out from my living room onto the porch. It was a Tuesday night when the pattern began. I had gotten home around midnight, completely exhausted from a terrible shift. I locked the front door, made sure the porch light switch was flipped up, and walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. From the kitchen island, I had a clear line of sight through the living room and straight to the large picture window. The cheap plastic blinds were pulled down, but they were angled slightly open, allowing the bright orange glow from the porch to spill through the glass and cast long, sharp shadows across my living room floor. I was standing there drinking my water when the living room suddenly went completely dark. The orange glow coming through the window vanished in an instant. I stopped drinking and looked over at the glass. The front yard outside was pitch black. I stood there for exactly 3 seconds, feeling slightly confused. Then the bright orange light popped right back on. The shadows returned to the living room floor. I set my glass down on the counter. I figured it was just a random power surge, or maybe the old wiring inside the brass fixture was finally starting to fail in the freezing winter temperatures. It was an old house, and minor electrical issues were completely normal. I did not give it a second thought. I turned off the kitchen lights and went to bed. 2 nights later, on Thursday, the weather was absolutely freezing. A heavy, wet snow was falling over the neighborhood, dampening all the ambient sound outside. I was sitting on my living room couch at 1 in the morning, reading a book with only a small reading lamp turned on. As I turned the page, the orange light shining through the window blinds abruptly cut out. The room plunged into heavy shadow. I looked up from my book and stared at the window. I counted in my head, 1, 2, 3. The light violently clicked back on. I kept my eyes locked on the window, waiting. Exactly 1 minute passed in total silence. Then, the light immediately cut out again. 1, 2, 3, it clicked back on. Something felt off. A failing electrical wire usually flickers rapidly and randomly. A dying light bulb will buzz and dim before it completely burns out. They do not turn off entirely, wait a perfectly timed 3 seconds, and then turn back on at full brightness. It looked entirely deliberate. I stood up from the couch and walked over to the entryway. I placed my hand on the physical plastic switch on the wall. It was pushed firmly in the upward, on position. The switch was not loose. I felt a little uneasy. I slowly leaned forward and pressed my eye directly against the small glass peephole in the center of the heavy wooden door. I had a clear, wide-angle view of the concrete porch. The bright orange light was illuminating the falling snow. The porch was completely empty. There were no footprints visible on the thin layer of white snow accumulating on the concrete steps. I watched through the distorted glass for 5 minutes, but the light remained perfectly steady. I eventually backed away, double-checked the deadbolt, and forced myself to go to sleep. By Saturday evening, the situation had been eating at me all day. I could not shake the heavy, paranoid feeling that someone was standing right outside my house while I was sitting comfortably on my couch. I knew the only way to know for sure was to catch it happening in real time. I arrived home from my shift at midnight. I parked my car, unlocked the front door, and flipped the porch light switch on. But this time I did not turn on a single light inside the house. I kept the entire interior pitch black. I left my heavy winter jacket on, walked quietly into the living room, and stood directly next to the large picture window. I carefully reached out and pulled one single plastic blind down just a fraction of an inch, creating a tiny gap for me to look through. I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the brass light fixture and the empty concrete porch. I stood there in the freezing darkness of my living room and waited. The first hour passed incredibly slowly. The street was dead quiet. There was no wind, and the snow from Thursday had already turned into solid, dirty ice on the lawn. The bright orange light from the bulb remained perfectly steady, reflecting off the frozen grass. My legs were starting to cramp, and my eyes were burning from staring so intensely at the bright light. At exactly 1:45 a.m., the silence was broken. Over the sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, I heard a sound coming from the outside of my house. It was a slow, heavy scraping noise. It sounded exactly like the thick, wet rubber sole of a heavy work boot pressing deliberately onto the first concrete step of the porch. I completely stopped breathing. I stood absolutely rigid by the window, my eye pressed to the tiny gap in the blinds. The sound did not repeat. The porch looked entirely empty. A few moments later, I saw movement coming from the bottom edge of my window frame. A massive, thick hand wrapped entirely in a filthy, dark rag reached slowly upward into my line of sight. It moved deliberately toward the brass light fixture mounted on the brick wall. The hand grabbed the glowing LED bulb directly. I watched in total horror as the hand slowly and forcefully twisted the bulb to the left. I could faintly hear the gritty, metallic sound of the metal threads grinding against the socket. The moment the connection broke, the porch plunged into absolute darkness. My stomach dropped. I was completely blind. I was standing less than 3 feet away from the glass, separated only by a thin layer of cheap plastic blinds and a pane of glass, and there was a grown man standing in the pitch black directly on the other side. The silence in the dark room was suffocating. I counted the seconds in my head, my heart violently hammering against my ribs. 1, 2, 3. I heard the gritty, metallic grinding noise again, as the hand twisted the bulb back to the right. The bright orange light violently popped back on, flooding the porch with harsh illumination. But the porch was not empty anymore. The moment the light returned, a massive, incredibly broad-shouldered man was standing directly in front of my living room window. He was so close to the glass that his heavy, dark winter coat was almost brushing against the pane. He was standing entirely still, positioning his massive body to completely block the harsh light from the fixture. He cupped both of his bare hands against the cold glass of the picture window and pressed his face directly against his hands, trying to peer through the blinds into my dark living room. I was standing less than an inch away from him on the other side. I did not move a single muscle. I was completely paralyzed. His face was obscured by the shadows in his thick hands, but I could hear his heavy, wet breathing fogging up the exterior glass. He was methodically scanning the interior of my house, trying to see if anyone was awake inside. He was intentionally turning the light off and on, creating a noticeable pattern, specifically hoping I would get off my couch and walk over to the window to investigate the broken bulb. He wanted to know exactly where I was. He stood there, staring into the dark room for what felt like an eternity. The heavy silence between us was agonizing. Then very slowly he lowered his hands from the glass. He turned his heavy body away from the window, and I heard the wet rubber squeak of his boots as he slowly walked back down the concrete steps and disappeared into the pitch-black shadows of the tree line. I immediately dropped to my hands and knees and crawled backward across the living room carpet. I grabbed my cell phone off the kitchen counter and dialed the police. I locked myself inside the bathroom until 2 patrol cars arrived 15 minutes later. The officers searched my entire property, including the dense woods behind the house, but they did not find anyone. When the officer came inside to take my statement, he mentioned that he had gone to turn my porch light off, but the bulb was completely loose in the socket. It was just hanging by the last metal thread, ready to be easily removed. I had an expensive, motion-activated security camera installed the very next day, and I replaced the heavy wooden front door with a solid steel one. But I never turned that porch light on anymore. I prefer to leave the front of my house completely dark. How many nights do you think he was standing out there twisting that bulb before I finally decided to look out the window? Story 14. It was the first closing shift at the retail store I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. My name is Dana Hollies. I work as a floor supervisor at a massive standalone retail store that specializes in home goods, decor, and basic hardware. The building itself is an enormous, cavernous warehouse. It has high, exposed industrial ceilings, incredibly tall metal shelving units that stretch toward the roof, and bright, buzzing fluorescent lighting that covers every square inch of the expansive sales floor. Our normal operating hours end at 10 p.m. sharp. After the heavy glass front doors are locked and the final customers are ushered out, the closing crew usually stays until about 11. Our job is to systematically restock the empty shelves, clean the public bathrooms, and balance the cash registers in the back office. Because the store is so large, it has an automated public address system wired into the ceiling. Every single night at exactly 9:45 p.m., a pre-recorded female voice plays over the overhead speakers. It announces that the store will be closing in 15 minutes and politely asks all remaining customers to bring their final purchases to the front registers. It is a very generic, cheerful, digital recording. It triggers automatically through the main computer system located in the secure back office. Once the audio file plays, the system logs the broadcast with a specific timestamp. It was a Tuesday night in early October when I first noticed the issue. We had locked the front doors at 10 p.m. and the last few straggling customers had already driven out of the parking lot. There were only 3 of us left in the massive building, myself, a junior cashier, and the night manager. I was working in the very back corner of the store, organizing a heavy display of ceramic gardening pots in the outdoor section. The store was completely quiet. The background music had been turned off, leaving only the low, constant hum of the industrial refrigerators in the break room. At exactly 10:30 p.m., the overhead speakers suddenly emitted a loud burst of sharp static. The sudden noise echoed aggressively through the cavernous building. Then, the cheerful, pre-recorded female voice rang out over the empty store. "Attention shoppers, our store will be closing in 15 minutes. Please bring your final purchases to the front registers." I stopped lifting the heavy ceramic pots and looked up at the high ceiling. I felt a little confused. The automated message was rigidly programmed to play only once, specifically before closing time. In the 3 years I had worked there, it had never repeated itself after hours. I simply assumed the computer system was experiencing a strange software glitch. When I finished my task and walked to the front of the store, my manager made a passing, light-hearted joke about the ghost in the machine. We finished our shift, set the security alarms, and went home without another thought. The following night, Wednesday, the exact same thing happened. We locked the heavy glass doors at 10 p.m. At 10:30 p.m., while I was sweeping the linoleum floor in the main center aisle, the overhead speakers clicked on. The sharp burst of static hissed, and the exact same cheerful announcement played through the empty aisles. This time I decided to actually investigate the computer system. As the floor supervisor, I had restricted access to the main terminal in the back office. When my shift was over, I walked into the cramped room, sat down in the rolling chair, and pulled up the automated broadcast log on the monitor. I carefully scrolled down to the very bottom of the black screen, looking for the recent timestamps. The digital log clearly showed that the closing message had triggered at exactly 9:45 p.m., exactly as it was supposed to. But there was absolutely no record of a second broadcast. The system had not played the audio file at 10:30 p.m. according to the software. The audio channels had been completely inactive since the store officially closed. Something felt off. I felt uneasy. The automated system was entirely digital. If the computer had played the file, it would have definitely generated a timestamp on the screen. The absolute only other way to broadcast an announcement over the overhead speakers was to physically pick up one of the heavy plastic paging microphones located at the customer service desk or back in the shipping warehouse. But I knew for a fact that both of those areas had been completely empty. I rationalized that it must be a deeper, unrecorded software error and submitted a routine maintenance ticket to corporate before I clocked out. By Friday night, the situation escalated dramatically. Due to severe payroll cuts that week, the scheduling manager had made a significant error. I was the only regular employee scheduled to close the sales floor. A single manager was supposed to be there with me, but he had a sudden family emergency and was forced to leave the building the absolute second the doors locked at 10 p.m. He rushed out the front exit, leaving me completely alone in the massive, silent building to finish the final walkthrough, turn off the lights, and set the security alarm. I was not happy about being completely alone in such a large space, but I just wanted to get my tasks done and go home. By 10:45 p.m., I had finished checking all the aisles and was walking toward the front of the store. The overhead lights had already automatically switched to their low-power overnight mode. The vast majority of the sales floor was cast in deep, heavy shadows, making the long aisles look like dark tunnels. Only the main register area and the customer service desk were fully illuminated. I was walking quietly down an aisle of tall, decorative wall mirrors when I heard a sound. It was the sharp, distinct electrical click of the public address system turning on. But this time there was no loud burst of static preceding the message. There was just the heavy, open hum of a live microphone filling the quiet store. A few seconds later, the closing announcement started to play, but it was entirely wrong. It was not the crisp, digital recording of the cheerful female voice. It was a physical person speaking directly into a microphone, deliberately trying to mimic the exact cadence and tone of the automated message. The voice sounded incredibly deep, rough, and slightly distorted, as if the person was pressing their mouth directly against the plastic receiver. "Attention shoppers," the voice dragged the words out, speaking incredibly slowly, echoing off the metal shelves. "Our store will be closing in 15 minutes. My stomach dropped. I stood completely frozen in the dark aisle. My reflection stared back at me in the dozens of mirrors lining the shelves, illuminated only by the distant front lights. The voice echoing through the massive, empty building did not sound like a computer glitch anymore. It sounded like a physical threat. "Please bring your final purchases to the front registers." The heavy electrical hum of the live microphone remained open for several seconds after the sentence finished. During that open silence, I heard a very specific sound coming through the overhead speakers. It was the faint, muffled sound of a heavy metal cash drawer being slowly pushed shut. I knew exactly where that sound came from. The only metal cash registers on the entire floor were located directly behind the customer service desk at the very front of the store, the exact same desk that housed the primary paging microphone. I did not move a single muscle. I was standing about 50 feet away from the customer service area, completely hidden in the dark aisle of mirrors. The PA system suddenly clicked off with a sharp pop, leaving the massive store in absolute, suffocating silence. I slowly leaned forward and peered carefully around the edge of the metal shelving unit, looking straight toward the brightly lit front registers. The customer service desk was a large, circular wooden counter elevated slightly above the main floor. Standing directly behind the counter, holding the plastic paging microphone in his hand, was a very tall man wearing a dark, filthy winter coat. His hood was pulled up tight, completely obscuring his face in shadow. He was not looking at the registers or the glass exit doors. He was standing perfectly still, slowly scanning the dark aisles, looking straight out onto the sales floor where I was hiding. He gently set the microphone down on the counter. I could hear the faint sound of the plastic tapping against the wood from where I was standing. He slowly stepped out from behind the desk and began walking down the main center aisle, heading directly into the dark sections of the store. He was moving silently, taking slow, deliberate steps. He was searching for me. I did not wait for him to get closer. The moment he passed the first row of heavy shelves and his line of sight was blocked, I violently turned around and sprinted toward the back warehouse doors as fast as I possibly could. I did not care how much noise my shoes made against the linoleum. I ran blindly through the dark aisles, terrified that I would hear heavy footsteps chasing right behind me. I hit the heavy metal swinging doors of the warehouse, threw myself into the back concrete hallway, and ran straight out the emergency fire exit, instantly triggering the deafening security alarm. I ran all the way to my car in the empty parking lot, locked myself inside, and called the police. They arrived within minutes and completely surrounded the building. They searched the entire massive store with heavy flashlights and police dogs. They did not find anyone. The store was entirely empty. The back receiving doors were still locked from the inside, and there was absolutely no sign of forced entry anywhere on the property. When the store manager arrived hours later to review the security footage, we realized something horrifying. The cameras positioned directly over the customer service desk had been physically unplugged at 9:30 p.m., well before the store had even closed to the public. I checked the computer system one last time while the police were taking their final report. There was absolutely no log of the broadcast playing. How long do you think he had been hiding inside the building after hours, just practicing that voice? Story 15. This happened during a severe winter storm. Everyone else was worried about what was going on outside, but what scared me was inside my own house. My name is Luca Fenwick. I live completely alone in a small, single-story rental house located on the outskirts of a quiet suburban town. The property is very isolated. My house sits at the end of a long, dead-end road, surrounded by a dense line of thick pine trees that completely block the view of the nearest neighbors. The house itself is incredibly old, built sometime in the 1950s. It is drafty, the insulation is terrible, and the walls are thin. But the most prominent feature of the entire house is the original hardwood flooring that runs through every single room. The wood is heavily scuffed, faded, and extremely noisy. Because the house has settled unevenly over the decades, the floorboards shift constantly. I know every single sound this house makes, but there is one very specific spot on the floor that is louder than the rest. It is located exactly 1 foot inside the threshold of my bedroom door. There is a long plank of oak right there that has warped significantly, creating a slight upward bow in the wood. Whenever any amount of physical weight is applied to that specific board, it rubs violently against the joist underneath. It makes a very loud, sharp, agonizing groaning noise. It is absolutely impossible to step on that spot quietly. Because I have lived in the house for over 2 years, I have developed a subconscious physical habit. Whenever I walk into or out of my bedroom, I naturally take a slightly longer stride to step completely over that specific board, avoiding the loud noise entirely. I am a very light sleeper, and the layout of the house makes me feel slightly exposed. The short hallway connects the kitchen directly to my bedroom at the very back of the house. I always sleep with my bedroom door pushed almost all the way shut. I leave just a tiny, 1-inch vertical gap in the frame to allow the warm air from the hallway heater to circulate into the room. It was a Tuesday night in early February when the pattern began. The weather had been terrible all week. A massive winter storm had knocked the temperature down near zero, and the wind was blowing aggressively against the exterior walls of the house. I had gotten under my heavy blankets around 11:30 p.m. The house was completely dark, and the street outside was desolate. Around midnight, I was just starting to drift off to sleep. The heater was humming quietly in the hallway. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It was the distinct, heavy groaning noise of the floorboard right inside my doorway. It happened just once. I heard the wood compress down, make the loud, sharp sound, and then instantly release. I opened my eyes and looked across the dark room toward the door. The thin vertical line of darkness from the hallway looked exactly the same. The door had not moved. I felt a little confused. I lay there in the silence for a few minutes, listening intensely. I did not hear any footsteps in the hallway. I did not hear any other doors closing in the house. I simply rationalized that the severe drop in temperature outside was causing the old wooden frame of the house to rapidly contract. It was a perfectly logical explanation. I rolled over, pulled the blankets up to my chin, and went back to sleep. 2 nights later, on Thursday, the wind had died down completely. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy layer of ice that coated the entire neighborhood. The silence outside was absolute. I was lying in bed reading an article on my phone. It was exactly 1 a.m. I eventually set my phone face down on the nightstand, turning the screen off and plunging the entire bedroom into pitch black darkness. About 10 minutes later, the floorboard groaned again. This time, it sounded significantly louder in the dead quiet of the house. It did not sound like a quick, natural pop of contracting wood. It sounded exactly like a heavy, concentrated mass pressing deliberately onto the center of the bowed board. My stomach dropped. I sat up slightly in my mattress, gripping the edge of my heavy blanket. I stared directly at the dark gap of the doorway. I held my breath, waiting for the sound of a second footstep. I waited for over 20 minutes. I expected to hear the floorboards in the hallway shift or the sound of someone walking away toward the kitchen. But the silence in the house was incredibly heavy and suffocating. There was absolutely no rustling, no breathing, and no movement. The house was completely empty. Something felt off, but my exhaustion eventually won. I told myself that the house was just incredibly old and the foundation was shifting in the frozen ground. I lay back down on my pillow, but it took me a very long time to finally close my eyes. By Saturday night, I was feeling highly paranoid. I spent the entire evening checking all the locks on the doors and making sure every single window latch was secured tight. Before I went to bed, I walked into my room, carefully stepped over the bowed floorboard, and positioned my heavy wooden door. I pushed it until it was almost entirely closed, measuring the exact 1-inch gap with my fingers. I got into bed, turned off the lamp, and stared at the dark ceiling. At exactly 2:30 a.m., I woke up completely out of nowhere. I did not know what woke me. My eyes just snapped open in the darkness. The house was completely dead silent. The heater had turned off, and the air in my bedroom felt freezing cold. I lay perfectly still on my back, listening to the quiet. Then the absolute silence broke. The floorboard right inside my doorway let out a loud, agonizing groan. I froze completely. The noise did not stop quickly like it had on the previous nights. It sounded like someone had placed the thick rubber sole of a heavy boot directly onto the center of the wood and was slowly, methodically transferring their entire body weight onto that specific spot. I heard the old wood compress down as far as it could possibly go, straining under the immense pressure. Then I heard a second sound. It was a faint, soft shifting noise on the floorboards directly next to the first one. It sounded exactly like the deliberate, careful placement of a second foot touching the hardwood. 2 slow, careful steps into my room. I felt incredibly uneasy. I was entirely paralyzed in my bed. I did not reach for the phone on my nightstand. I did not make a single sound. I slowly turned my head on the pillow, moving by inches, and looked toward the bedroom doorway. When I had gone to sleep, the door was open just 1 single inch. Now the dark vertical gap was at least 1.5 feet wide. Someone had silently pushed the heavy wooden door open while I was sleeping and taken a deliberate step into my bedroom. But they had not known about the bowed floorboard. The loud groaning noise of the wood had completely betrayed their exact position in the dark. I lay completely motionless. I just stared into the pitch-black corner of the room, right where the doorway opened into the hallway. The darkness was absolute. I could not see a face, and I could not see a silhouette. But I could feel the intense, heavy presence of a massive person standing just a few feet away from the end of my bed. I knew exactly what was happening. Whoever had stepped inside was standing perfectly still in the dark. They were holding their breath, waiting to see if the loud creak of the floorboard had woken me up. They were standing there in the pitch black, listening to the rhythm of my breathing from across the room, trying to figure out if I was still asleep. The heavy silence stretched on for an excruciatingly long time. I kept my breathing incredibly slow and steady, forcing my chest to rise and fall in a deep, rhythmic pattern to mimic heavy sleep. My heart was violently hammering against my ribs, making my entire body shake slightly under the thick blankets. I was terrified that if my breathing hitched or if I reached for my phone, the person standing in the dark would immediately rush forward and cover the short distance to my bed. I lay there in the pitch black for over 2 hours. I never heard the floorboard groan a second time. I never heard the soft sound of footsteps walking backward into the hallway. I just lay there, maintaining the exact same breathing pattern, staring into the dark corner until my eyes burned. When the pale, gray morning light finally began to filter through the cracks in my window blinds, slowly illuminating the corners of my bedroom, I saw that the space by the door was completely empty. I slowly sat up in bed, my legs shaking violently. I walked out into the hallway and checked the entire house. It was completely empty. But when I walked into the small kitchen, I noticed the heavy deadbolt on the back door was unlocked, and the wooden door was resting slightly ajar, letting the freezing morning air blow into the house. I packed a single bag, drove to a cheap motel, and broke my lease that exact same week. I never slept another night in that house. How long do you think they stood perfectly still in that dark corner, just watching me sleep, before they finally decided to back out?